Audiobook. The Agony and the Ecstasy. Author, Irving Stone. Book 5. The City. He stood on a rise just north of the city. Rome lay below in its bed of hills, destroyed, as though sacked by vandals. Leo Bagliani traced the outlines of the Leonine Wall, the fortress of Sant'Angelo. They got back on their horses and descended to the Porta del Popolo, passing the tomb of Nero's mother to enter the small piazza. It stank from piled garbage. Above them to the left was the Pincio hill covered with vineyards. The streets they followed were narrow lanes with broken cobbles underfoot. The noise of carts passing over the stones was so deafening that Michelangelo could barely hear Bagliani identifying the dilapidated tomb of the Roman Emperor Augustus, now a grazing field for cows, the Campo Marzio, a plain near the Tiber inhabited by the poorer artisans whose shops were huddled between ancient palaces that looked as though they would topple at any moment. More than half of the buildings he passed were gutted. Goats wandered among the fallen stones. Bagliani explained that the previous December the Tiber had flooded and the people had had to flee for 3 days to the surrounding hills, returning to a dank, decaying city in which the plague struck and 150 corpses were buried each morning on the island in the river. Michelangelo felt sick to his stomach. The mother city of Christendom was a waste heap and a dunghill. Dead animals lay under the feet of their horses. Wrecking crews were breaking out walls of building stone for use elsewhere, burning marble slabs and columns for their lime content. He guided his horse around a piece of ancient statuary sticking up through the dirt of the road, past rows of abandoned houses, salt and vines growing in their crumbling mortar. Skirting a Grecian temple, he saw pigs bend between its columns. In a block-square subterranean vault with broken columns half emerging from an ancient forum there was a horrendous odor, rising from hundreds of years of dumped refuse, and generations of men whose descendants even now were squatting over it, void, defecating into its depth. His host led him through a series of dark, winding streets where 2 horses could barely pass each other, past the Theatre of Pompey with hundreds of families living in its yawning vault, and then at last into the Campo de' Fiori where he saw his first signs of recognizable life, a vegetable, flour, cheese, fish and meat market, crowded with row upon row of clean colorful stalls, the cooks and housewives of Rome shopping for their dinner. For the first time since they had descended into Rome he was able to look at his host and tender him a wisp of a smile. Frightened? Leo Bagliani asked. Or revulsed? Both. Several times I almost turned my horse and made a run for Florence. Rome is pitiful. You should see the pilgrims who come from all over Europe. They are robbed, beaten, ridden down by our princely processions, bitten half to death by vermin in the inns, then separated from their last denaro in the churches. Bracciolini wrote some 60 years ago, the public and private buildings lie prostrate, nude and broken like the limbs of a giant. Rome is a decaying corpse. Pope Sixtus IV made a real effort to widen the streets and repair some of the buildings, but under the Borgias the city has fallen into a worse condition than that of which Bracciolini wrote. Here's my home. Standing on a corner overlooking the market was a well-designed house of 3 floors. Inside, the rooms were small and sparsely furnished with walnut tables and chairs, but richly carpeted, with tapestries and precious cloths on the walls, and decorated with painted wooden cupboards, gold mirrors and red leather ornaments. Michelangelo's sailcloth bag was carried up to the 3rd floor. He was given a corner room overlooking the market and a staggeringly huge, new stone palace which his host told him was just being completed by Cardinal Riario, who had bought his bambino. They had an excellent dinner in a dining room that was protected from the noises of the street. Late in the afternoon they strolled to the Cardinal's old villa, through the Piazza Navona, former site of the long stadium of Domitian, where Michelangelo was fascinated by a half-buried, half-excavated marble torso, brilliantly carved, standing before the house of one of the Orsini, a relative of Piero's wife Alfonsina, and which Leo thought might be Menelaus carrying Patroclus. They continued on to the Piazza Fiumetta, named after the mistress of Caesar Borgia, son of the Pope, and then to the Riario Palace facing the Via Sistina and the city's cleanest end, the Osteria dell'Orso, Inn of the Bear. Bagliani filled in his background on Raphael Riario di San Giorgio, a grandnephew of Pope Sixtus IV who had been made a cardinal when an 18-year-old student at the University of Pisa. The young cardinal had gone for a visit to the Medici palace in Florence, and had been worshipping at the altar in the Duomo when assassins killed Giuliano de' Medici and stabbed Lorenzo. Though Lorenzo and the Florentines had been convinced that it was Pope Sixtus and his nephews who had connived with the Pazzi to murder both Medici, Lorenzo had absolved the cardinal of knowledge of the plot. Cardinal Riario received Michelangelo amidst piles of boxes and hay-packed trunks that were being readied for moving. He read Lorenzo Popolano's letter of introduction, bade Michelangelo welcome to Rome. Your bambino was well sculptured, Buonarrotti, even though it was not an antique. I have the impression that you can carve something quite fine for us. Thank you, Excellency. I should like you to go out this afternoon and see our best marble statues. Start with the Arch of Domitian on the Corso, then go to the Column of Trajan, after that see the Capitoline collection of bronzes that my granduncle, Sixtus IV, started. By the time the cardinal finished he had named some 20 pieces of sculpture in a dozen different collections and parts of the city. Leo Bagliani guided him first to see the river god Marforio, a monstrous-sized statue lying in the street between the Roman Forum and the Forum of Augustus, which was supposed to have been in the Temple of Mars. From here they moved on to the Column of Trajan, where Michelangelo exclaimed over the carving of the lion devouring the horse. They walked up the winding quirinal hill where he was stunned by the size and brute force of the 18-foot-high marble horse tamers and the gods of the Nile and the Tiber, the Nile resting an arm on a sphinx, the Tiber leaning on a tiger, which Leo thought came out of the baths of Constantine. Near them was a nude goddess of breathtaking beauty, probably a Venus, proffered Leo. They continued on to the garden of Cardinal Rovere at San Pietro in Vincoli, Leo explaining that this nephew of Sixtus IV was the founder of the first public library and museum of bronzes in Rome, had accumulated the finest collection of antique marbles in Italy, and had been Sixtus' inspiring force in the project to fresco the walls of the Sistine chapel. Michelangelo stood breathless when he entered the little iron gate of Cardinal Rovere's garden, for here was an Apollo, just the torso remaining, that was the most staggering piece of human projection he had ever seen. As he had in the Medici palace on his first visit with Bertoldo, he moved half-stunned in a forest of sculpture, from a Venus to an Antaeus to a Mercury, his mind captivated, only dimly hearing Leo's voice telling him which pieces had been stolen from Greece, which had been bought by Emperor Hadrian and sent to Rome by the shipload. If Florence were the richest center in the world for the creation of art, surely this miserably dirty, decaying city must hold the greatest collection of antique art. And here was the proof of what he had tried to tell his fellow Garlateo apprentices on the steps of the Duomo. Here were marble carvings as alive and beautiful as the day they were carved, 2,000 years ago. Now we shall go to see the bronze Marcus Aurelius before the Lateran, continued Leo. Then perhaps. Please, no more. I'm quivering inside. I must lock myself in my room and try to digest what I've already seen. He could eat no supper that night. The next morning, Sunday, Leo took him to Mass in the little church of San Lorenzo in Damaso, next to Cardinal Riario's new palace, and attached to it by a breakthrough in one of its walls. Michelangelo was staggered to find himself surrounded by 100 marble and granite columns, no two alike, carved by expert stonemasons, each with a differently sculptured capital, eclectically borrowed from all over Rome, Leo explained, but mainly from the front of the portico of the Theatre of Pompey. The Cardinal wished Michelangelo to come to the new palace. The vast stone edifice, twice the size of the Medici palace, was finished except for the central courtyard. Michelangelo climbed a broad flight of stairs, went through the audience chamber with rich tapestry curtains and mirrors framed in jasper, the drawing room with oriental carpets and carved walnut chairs, the music room with a beautiful harpsichord, until he came upon the Cardinal in his red hat and vestments, sitting in his antique sculpture room, with a dozen pieces lying in open boxes filled with sawdust. "Tell me, Buonarotti, what do you think of the marbles you have seen? Can you do something equally beautiful?" "I may not carve anything as beautiful, but we will see what I can do." "I like that answer, Buonarotti, it shows humility." He did not feel humble, all he had meant was that his pieces would be different from anything he had seen. "We had best start at once," continued Riario. "My carriage is outside. It can take us to the stone yard." As the Cardinal's groom drove them across the Sistine bridge and through the Settimana gate to the Trastevere stone yards, Michelangelo studied the face of his new patron. It was said that Riario had been so shocked at the Medici stabbings that his face had turned purple, in fact it remains so to this day. He had a long, hooked nose that clamped down on a tight-lipped mouth. Once in the stone yard, Cardinal Riario seemed impatient. Michelangelo wandered among the blocks wondering how large a piece he dared select. Finally he stopped before a white Carrara column over 7 feet tall and 4 feet thick. His eyes lighted with excitement. He assured the Cardinal that there could be a fine statue contained in it. Cardinal Riario quickly paid out 37 ducats from the purse on his belt. The next morning Michelangelo rose at first light, made his way downstream to the Florentine bridge and crossed the Tiber to Trastevere, densely inhabited section of Rome, home of the potters, tanners, millers, rope-makers, metal-workers, fishermen, boatmen, gardeners, a sprawling population descended from the original Romans, self-contained within high walls in the Tiber, their crowded quarters unchanged for hundreds of years. He wound through a labyrinth of narrow streets, watched workmen handling raw materials in dark shops, all light cut off by projecting upper stories, the narrow houses jammed together, while above them the roofs pitched angularly, surmounted by bristling square towers. Peddlers were calling their wares, women and children brawling, open fish, cheese and meat marketeers crying out bargains, the whole of the tumultuous noise and smell locked on to overwhelm one's ears and eyes and nose. He walked along the Via della Lungara to the stone yard just outside the Vatican wall and Santo Spirito Hospital. Not a soul was stirring. He listened through a cacophony of cockcrows before the owner showed up. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, still half asleep and sullen. "We say we deliver today." "What we say, we do. I wasn't worried about your failure to deliver. I just thought I'd help load." "You telling me we don't know how to load?" Now the owner was insulted. "We been carting marble in Rome for 5 generations, and we need a Florentine statue maker to teach us our business? My family trained me in the Michelangelo quarries. I'm a pretty good hand with a crowbar." Mollified, the owner replied, "Quarryman, eh? That's different. We quarry travertine in our family. Gufati is our name." Michelangelo made sure there was a sufficient bed of sawdust and that the block was securely lashed before the open-end wagon started on its journey through streets rutted to the hubs of the wheels. He walked behind, patting the end of the column while praying that the rickety farm wagon, in this family for the 5 generations, would not collapse in a pile of splinters and leave the marble block in the roadbed. Arriving at the palace, Buffatti asked, "Where do we unload?" Michelangelo suddenly realized that he had not been told where he would work. He cried, "Wait right here!" Ran through the courtyard and up the broad staircase to the reception room, to come head-on against one of the palace secretaries, who glanced disapprovingly at this bundle of work clothes dashing into the main foyer of the newest palace in Rome. "I have to see the Cardinal immediately. It's urgent." "Urgent for the Cardinal, or you?" The cool tone slowed Michelangelo down. "It's the marble block. We bought it yesterday. It's arrived and I have no place." He stopped, watching the secretary thumb through an appointment calendar. "His Excellency has no time available until next week." Michelangelo stood with his mouth open. "But we can't wait. I'll take the matter up with His Eminence. If you would to return tomorrow." He ran back down the central staircase at full speed, out the palace, to the corner and across the street to Leo Bagliani's house. Leo was being barbered, a towel over his shoulders to catch the clipped locks. His eyes danced while he listened to Michelangelo's outburst. He told the barber to wait, removed the towel, rose from the only cushioned chair in the house. "Come, we'll find a space for you." Leo located a shed behind the cupola of San Lorenzo in Damaso, in which the workmen who built the palace had left their tools at night. Michelangelo removed the doors from their hinges. Leo returned to his barber. The Buffatti unloaded the marble. Michelangelo sat on the earthen floor before the block, holding his knees under his chin. "You are a beautiful piece of meat," he said fondly, and fell to musing about the kind of theme a prince of the church might choose for a life-size figure. Would it not have to be a religious subject? Yet the Cardinal had a liking for ancient Greek and Roman carvings. That afternoon the Cardinal sent for him. He was received in an austere room bare of all furniture. There was a small altar at one end, and a doorway beside it. Riario was wearing a severely tailored red cassock and skull cap. "Now that you are about to undertake a prolonged piece of work, you had better move into the palace. Signor Bagliani's guest room has a long list of lovely ladies waiting to share it." "On what terms am I to live in the palace, Excellency?" "Let us just say that your address is the palace of the Cardinal Riario. And now we must leave you. No word about what the Cardinal wanted sculptured, or what the price would be, or whether he was to have irregular payments during his year of work. The palace would be his address, he knew nothing more. But he learned. He was not to live here as a son, as he had in the Medici palace, nor as a close friend as in the Aldovandi home in Bologna. A chamberlain directed him to a narrow cell at the rear of the ground floor, one of perhaps 20 such rooms, where he unpacked his few possessions. When he went looking for his first meal he found himself relegated to what was known as the third category dining room, in which he found his companions to be the Cardinal's scriveners, the head bookkeeper, the purchasing agent for the palace, the managers of his far-flung farmlands, timber stands, ships, benefices all over Italy. The Cardinal Riario had made himself clear. Michelangelo Buonarrotti was to live in the palace as one of the crew of skilled workmen. Nothing more, and nothing less. Early the next morning he went to see Baldassare the art dealer, who had just been obliged to return Cardinal Riario's 200 ducats for the Bambino. Baldassare was a swarthy fat man with 3 jowls and an enormous stomach which he pushed ahead of him as he came from the back of his open sculpture yard, just off the Forum of Julius Caesar. Michelangelo's progress was slow in coming down the yard, for the dealer had a number of antiques mounted on bases. "I am Michelangelo Buonarrotti, sculptor of Florence." Baldassare made an obscene noise with his lips. "I want you to return my bambino. I will repay the 30 florins you sent me." "Certainly not," the dealer cried. "You defrauded me. All you were entitled to was your commission. You sold the marble for 200 ducats and kept 170. On the contrary, it is you and your friend Popoliano who are the frauds. You sent me a false antique. I could have lost the Cardinal's patronage." Michelangelo walked fuming out of the yard, half ran down the Via Santa. He crossed the street, stood gazing at Trajan's column until his head cleared. Then he burst into laughter. "Baldassare is right. It is I who was the cheat. I falsified the bambino." He heard someone behind him exclaim, "Michelangelo Buonarrotti. Do you always talk to yourself?" He turned, recognized the chap of his own age who had been apprenticed to the Money Changers Guild and worked briefly for his uncle Francesco in an early period of prosperity. They might have known each other for 100 years in Florence and never become friends, but here they fell on each other's necks. "Balducci. What are you doing in Rome?" "Working for Jacopo Galli's bank. Head bookkeeper. The dumbest Florentine is smarter than the smartest Roman. That's why I'm moving up so fast. How about having dinner together? I'll take you to a Tuscan restaurant in the Florentine section. I can't stand this Roman food. Wait till you taste the tortellini and beefsteak, you'll think you're back in sight of the Duomo. There is time before noon. Come with me to the Sistine Chapel, I want to see the Florentine frescoes." The Sistine Chapel, built between 1473 and 1481, was a mammoth barrel-roofed structure with high windows toward the ceiling and a railed balcony walk beneath them. The rectangular dome was painted blue with gold stars scattered about. At the far end was the altar, and dividing the sanctuary and the nave, a marble screen by Mino da Fassole. What would have appeared a clumsily proportioned and graceless building was saved by a magnificent frieze of frescoed panels on both sides of the chapel, running full length to the altar. Michelangelo went excitedly to the Galileo frescoes which he remembered from the cartoons in the studio, the resurrection and the calling of Peter and Andrew. His admiration for Galateo's pictorial skill was renewed. Next he went to Rosselli's Last Supper, which he did not find as garish as Galateo had charged, then turned his gaze raptly to the Botticelli Moses before the burning bush, and to the Umbrian masters, Perugino, Pinturicchio and Signorelli. As he moved about the chapel he sensed that under this awkward, unbalanced roof there had been assembled the greatest combination of masters to be found in Italy. He decided that Perugino's Christ giving the keys to St. Peter stood up with the finest of the Florentine tradition, the highest compliment he could pay any artist. He remarked to Balducci how strange it was that the Stoffivi, Calvinist chapel, as inept and arid a piece of architecture as he had yet seen, could have called forth the painter's richest creative efforts. Balducci had not even glanced at the frescoes. "Let's get to the trattoria. I'm famished." While eating, Michelangelo learned that Agony was in Rome. "But you won't see much of him," said Balducci. "He consorts with the Borgias so the Florentines don't receive him. He's doing stuccos for the tower of the Borgia Palace, also a bust of the Pope. He has all the sculpture work he wants. He also says he is going to join Caesar Borgia's army to conquer Italy." That evening Balducci took him to the home of Paolo Rosselli, a cousin of the Russelli in Florence and hence a distant cousin of his own. Russelli lived in the district of Pont, known as a Little Florence, walled within itself. Here, centered around the Florentine consul's house and the Tuscan banks, the Florentines in Rome lived close together, with their own markets, which imported their pasta, meats, vegetables, fruits and sweets from Tuscany. They had acquired land on which to build a Florentine church, and had bought the few remaining houses on the Via Conali so that no Romans could move in. The hatred was mutual. The Romans said, "Better a corpse in the house than a Florentine at the door." The Florentines reinterpreted the SPQR of the Roman Senatus Populus K Romania to read, "Sono porci, questi Romani." They are pigs, these Romans. The Florentine section of Pont was the area held within a wide band of the river, in the center of which was the Florentine bridge leading to Trastevere. In the area were fine palaces, 2 streets of solidly built houses, with flower and vegetable gardens interspersed. The Florentine banks were on the Via Conali, adjoining the Camera Apostolica, the official bank of the Vatican. At the extreme end of the colony, near the bridge of Sant'Angelo, were the Pazzi and Altaviti palaces. Near the riverbank was an open space filled with flowers and vegetables which became a lake when the Tiber overflowed, as it had the year before. In the midst of the chaos and filth of Rome, the prosperous Florentines swept and washed down their streets every day at dawn, replaced the cobblestones to make a smooth and quiet roadbed, put their houses in a good state of repair, sold or leased only to Florentines. There were prohibitive fines against dumping refuse in the streets or hanging laundry from the front windows instead of the back. Armed guards policed the quarter at night. It was the only section where one was sure not to stumble over a corpse on one stoop at daybreak. At the Russelli house he was presented to the leading families of the community, the Tornabuoni, Strai, Pazzi, Altaviti, Bracci, Olivieri, Ranfridini and Cavalcanti, to whom he was carrying a letter of introduction. Some of the Florentines were bankers, others were silk and wool merchants, jewelers, importers of wheat, gold and silversmiths, ship owners and shipbuilders who had thriving ports at Ripagrande and Ripetta, where boats came up the Tiber from the sea carrying luxuries from the Near East, wines and oil from Tuscany, marble from Carrara, timber from across the Adriatic. A number of the men asked, "Who is your father?" When he replied, "L'Audiobook Buonarotti Simone," they nodded their heads, said, "I know the name," accepting him forthwith. The Russelli had converted their Roman house into pure Florentine, with the recessed fireplace surrounded by Beatrice Serena, the floor of the dining room tiled in the tradition of Luca dell'Arabia, and the familiar inlaid furniture so beloved of his countrymen. He did not tell handsome affable Paolo that he too was a Russelli. The Russelli had terminated the family relationship with the Buonarotti. His pride would never let him be the first to speak. He set up his 7-foot block on beams braced from behind so that he could move around it. His disappointment that the Cardinal did not immediately present him with a specific subject gave way to the realization that it would be better if he himself knew what he wanted to carve. Then he would not have to ask humbly, "What would your Excellency like me to make out of this marble?" Exercise extreme calm. Leo warned him, not to touch that column until Cardinal Riario gives you permission to do so. He is adamant about his properties. I could not hurt the marble, Leo, by rounding the edges and exploring a little. He was humiliated at being cautioned like a laborer not to manhandle the property of his patron. Yet he had to promise not to chip a single crystal off the block. "You can use your time profitably," said Leo placatingly. "There are wonderful things in Rome to study." "Yes, I know," said Michelangelo. Why try to explain his marble fever? He changed the subject. Can one secure nude models in Rome? It is not allowed in Florence. Leo replied mischievously, that's because we Romans are a clean and moral people. But you Florentines. He laughed as Michelangelo flushed. I suppose it's because we have never suffered from the Greek sickness, and Florence has been famous, or should I say infamous, for it. Here our men have been making business deals, arranging political alignments and marriages while they take their leisure and exercise in the nude. Could you arrange for me to have models? Tell me what kind you want. All kinds, short, tall, skinny, fat, young and old, dark and light, laborers and idlers, traders. He set up a low screen to give him a modicum of privacy. The next morning Leo's first nominee arrived, a burly middle-aged cooper who shed his stinking shirt and sandals and moved about unconcernedly as Michelangelo directed him to a variety of poses. Each morning at sunrise he went out to his workshop to prepare his paper, chalk, ink, charcoal, colored crayons, not knowing what new task the day's model would bring. Corsicans who formed the papal bodyguard, German typographers, French perfumers and glove makers, Teutonic bakers, Spanish booksellers, Lombard carpenters from the Campo Marzio, Dalmatian boat builders, Greek copyists, Portuguese trunk makers from the Via de Bolari, goldsmiths from beside San Giorgio. Sometimes they were superb figures whom he drew in full frontal or rear positions, posed straining, turning, lifting, pushing, twisting, battling with an array of work tools, clubs, stones. More often the whole figure would not be interesting, only a specially knotted shoulder, the shape of a skull, an iron-corded calf, a barrel chest, and then he would spend the entire day drawing only that one segment seen from a dozen angles and in differing postures. His years of training were coming into focus. The months of dissection had given his drawing an authority, an inner truth that had changed the projection of his work. Even the urbane and sophisticated Leo commented on the propulsive force of these figures. Each morning you come out to a different model as though you were going on an exciting adventure. Don't you get tired drawing the same thing over and over again? Head, arms, torso, legs. But Leo, they are never the same. Every arm and leg and neck and hip in the world is different with a true character of its own. Listen, my friend, all forms that exist in God's universe can be found in the human figure. A man's body and face can tell everything he represents. So how could I ever exhaust my interest in it? Bagliani was entertained by Michelangelo's intensity. He glanced at the batch of sketches under Michelangelo's arm, shook his head unbelievingly. What about the inner qualities? In Rome we conceal rather than reveal what we are. That is a measure of the sculptor, how deeply can he penetrate the shell? With every subject I say to myself, what are you, truly, as you stand naked before the world? Leo pondered on this for a moment. Then, for you, sculpture is a search. Michelangelo smiled shyly. Isn't it, for all artists? Every man sees truth through his own funnel. I feel about each new figure the way an astronomer does each time he discovers a new star. One more fragment of the universe has been filled in. Perhaps if I could draw every male on earth I could accumulate the whole truth about man. Well then, said Leo, I would recommend that you come with me to the baths. There you can do 100 in a sitting. He took Michelangelo on a tour of the staggeringly vast and ornate ruins of the ancient baths of Caracalla, Trajan, Constantine, Diocletian, telling him of how the early Romans had used the baths as clubs, meeting halls, spending every afternoon of their lives in them. You have heard the line attributed to Caesar, give the populace bread and circuses. Several of the emperors felt it equally important to give them water, believing their popularity depended on how beautiful they made their public baths. Now that the baths were run for profit they were far less lavish, but they had several pools for swimming, steam and massage rooms, courts where the clients entertained each other with the day's gossip while musicians and jugglers made the rounds. Food vendors came through hawking their wares. The younger men played a variety of ball games. Leo was well known in the bath on the Piazza Sculptor, which belonged to the Cardinal Riario. After they had had their warm bath and a swim in a cold pool, they sat on a bench at the far end of the area where knots of men were sitting and standing, arguing, laughing, telling anecdotes, while Michelangelo composed scene after scene in a fever of composition. So superb were the model planes, curves and masses of the figures against each other. I've never seen anything like it. In Florence public baths are for the poor, he exclaimed. I will spread the word that you are in Rome on the Cardinal's invitation. Then you'll be able to sketch here to your heart's content. In the weeks that followed he took Michelangelo to the baths connected with the hostels, monasteries, old palaces, to the one in the Via de Sistine, to Sant'Angelo in the Pesseria. Everywhere Leo introduced Michelangelo so that he could come back alone, and in each new setting of light, wall color, reflection of sun and water on the bodies, he found fresh truths and ways of expressing them in simple bold lines. But he never quite got used to sketching while he himself was naked. Once a Florentine, he muttered to himself. One afternoon Leo asked, "Wouldn't you like to sketch some women? There are several baths for both sexes within the city walls, run by prostitutes, but with quite respectable clienteles. I have no interest in the female form. You're summarily dismissing half the figures to the world." Roughly, yes. They laughed together. But I find all beauty and structural power in the male. Take a man in any action, jumping, wrestling, throwing a spear, plowing, bend him into any position and the muscles, the distribution of weight and tension, have their symmetry. For me, a woman to be beautiful or exciting must be absolutely still. Perhaps you just haven't put them into the proper positions. Michelangelo smiled. Yes, I have. I find it a sight for love, but not for sculpture. He disliked Rome as a city, but then it was not one city but many, the Germans, French, Portuguese, Greeks, Corsicans, Sicilians, Arabs, Levantines, Jews all compacted within their own areas, welcoming outsiders no more than did the Florentines. Balducci had said to him, "These Romans are an ugly race." Or, I should say, 100 ugly races. He had found it a heterogeneous gathering of peoples who wore different clothes, spoke different languages, ate different foods, cherished different values. Everybody appeared to have come from somewhere else, habitually calling down a pox on the city for its decay, floods, pestilences, lawlessness, filth and corruption. Since there was no government, no laws or police courts or councils for protection, each section governed itself as best it could. The convenient cemetery of crimes was the Tiber, where floating corpses regularly greeted the early morning risers. There was no equitable distribution of wealth, justice, learning, art. As he walked for hours about Rome he found it a shambles, its widespread walls, which had protected 500,000 people in the days of the empire, now enclosing less than 70,000. Whole areas that had been populated were neglected ruins. There was hardly a block, even in the heavily populated sections, without black gaping holes between buildings, like missing teeth in an old-grown's mouth. Its architecture was a hodgepodge of crude dun-colored brick, black tufa stone, tan travertine, blocks of gray granite, pink and green marble stolen from other eras. The manners of the people were execrable. They ate in the streets, even the well-dressed wives emerging from bakery shops to walk along munching on fresh sugar rolls, chewing pieces of hot tripe and other specialties from the vendors' carts and street cookstoves, consuming dinner piecemeal in public. The residents had no pride in their city, no desire to improve it or provide rudimentary. They told him, "Rome is not a city, it's a church. We have no power to control or change it." When he asked, "Then why do people stay?" he was answered, "Because there is money to be made." Rome had the most unsavory reputation in Europe. The contrasts with homogeneous Florence, compact within its walls, immaculately clean, a self-governing republic, inspired of art and architecture, growing rapidly without poverty, proud of its tradition, revered throughout Europe for its learning and justice, were for him sharp and painful. Most personally painful was the atrocious stonework of the buildings he passed each day. In Florence he had rarely been able to resist running his fingers over the beautifully carved and fitted pietra serena of the edifices. Here he winced as his practiced eye picked out the crude strokes of the chisel, the gouged and blemished surfaces, the unmatched beveling. Florence would not have paved its streets with these botched building stones. He stopped in front of a construction in the Piazza del Pantheon, with its wood and iron pipe scaffolding held together at the joints by leather thongs. Masons putting up the wall of a house were pounding large blocks of travertine, bruising the substance because they did not know how to split it. He picked up a sledge, turned to the foreman and cried, "Permit? Permit you what?" He taped the end of a block, found its point of stratification, with a swift authoritative blow split it longways. Taking a hammer and chisel from the workman's hands, he shaped and beveled blocks out of the two layers, tooling the surfaces with long rhythmic strokes until the stone changed color as well as form, and glowed beneath his hand. He looked up to find himself surrounded by resentful eyes. One of the masons growled, "Stonework is for beasts. Do you think we would be here if we didn't have to eat?" Michelangelo apologized for intruding. He walked down the Via Pelliceria feeling a fool, yet for a Florentine stonemason the surfacing of a block constituted his self-expression. He was respected by his friends according to his skill and resourcefulness in modeling the stones to bring out their individual character. Working the stone was considered the most venerable of crafts, an inherent part of the elemental faith that man and stone had natural affinities. When he returned to the palace he found an invitation from Paolo Rucellite to attend a reception for Piero de' Medici, who was in Rome attempting to gather an army, and Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, who had taken a small house near the Via Florida. Michelangelo was touched to have been included, happy to leave his own dull room and board, to see Medici again. Saturday morning at 11, as he finished shaving and combing his hair, forming deep curls on his forehead, he heard the sound of trumpets and ran out to see the spectacle, excited to lay eyes at last on this Borgia Pope whom the Medici had feared and Savonarola had picked as his special target. Preceded by red-robed cardinals and the cross, and followed by purple-cloaked princes, Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia in Spain, dressed all in white, white stole and precious pearls, white robe on a white horse, was leading a procession through the Campo de' Fiori on his way to the Franciscan convent in Trastevere. 64-year-old Alexander VI appeared to be a man of enormous virility, built big of bone and flesh, with a widely arched nose, swarthy complexion and fleshy cheeks. Though he was called a theater actor in Rome, he possessed many attributes besides the brilliant insolence for which he was known. As Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia he had won the reputation of amassing more beautiful women and vaster sums of wealth than anyone preceding him. As early as 1460 he had been reproved by Pope Pius II for unseemly galantery, a euphemism that covered his 6 known children of the varying mothers, of whom his 3 favorites were one, playboy, exhibitionist, prodigious spender of the vast fortunes his father had absorbed from the Roman clergy and barons, Caesar, handsome sensualist, sadist and warrior, accused of clogging the Tiber with corpses, and the beautiful Lucrezia, accused by Rome of having informal love affairs between her growing list of official marriages. The high walls around the Vatican were guarded by 3,000 armed guards, but Rome had developed a communications system that spread news of the happenings there into the Seven Hills. If good things occurred, little of it leaked out. The full panoplied procession having passed, Michelangelo walked up the Via Florida to the pond. Because he had arrived too early, Paolo Russelli received him in his study, a room with dark wood paneling, containing bound manuscripts, marble bas-reliefs, oil paintings on wood, a Florentine carved desk and leather chairs. Paolo's handsome face resembled Bernardo Russelli's, with its strong regular features, large expressive eyes and light skin, none of which, Michelangelo mourned, had he inherited from his mother's family. "We Florentines are a tightly knit colony here," Paolo was saying. "As you know by now, we have our own government, treasury, laws, and means of enforcing them. Otherwise we could not exist in this morass. If you need help, come to us. Never go to a Roman. Their idea of a square deal is one in which they are protected on 5 sides." In the drawing room he met the rest of the Florentine colony. He bowed to Piero, who was cool and formal after their quarrel in Bologna. Cardinal Giovanni, despised by the Pope and frozen out of all church activity, seemed genuinely happy to see him, though Giulio was frigid. Michelangelo learned that Contessina had been brought to bed with a son, Luigi, and was again encinta. To his eager question about whether Giuliano was also in Rome, Giovanni replied, "Giuliano is at the court of Elisabetta Gonzaga and Guidobaldo Montefeltro in Urbino. He will complete his education there." The court of Urbino, high in the Apennines, was one of the most cultured in Italy. Giuliano would thrive. 30 Florentines sat down to dinner, eating cannelloni stuffed with fine chopped beef and mushrooms, veal and milk, tender green beans, drinking Broglio wines and talking animatedly. They never referred to their adversary as the Pope, or Alexander V, but only as the Borgia, striving to preserve their reverence for the papacy while expressing their utter contempt for the Spanish adventurer who through a series of calamitous mishaps had seized the Vatican and was ruling on the premise, according to Cavalcanti, that all the wealth of Christendom belongs to the papacy. And we shall have it. The Florentines in turn were not popular with the Pope. He knew them to be adversaries, but he needed their banks, world trade, the high import duties they paid on products brought into Rome, their stability. Unlike the Roman barons, they did not wage war against him, they just prayed fervently for his demise. For this reason they favored Savonarola in his struggle against the Pope, and found Piero's mission embarrassing. Over their port the guests grew nostalgic, spoke of Florence as though they were only a few minutes from the Piazza della Signoria. It was a moment for which Michelangelo had been waiting. "What about art commissions in Rome?" he asked. "The popes have always called in painters and sculptors." The Borgia summoned Pinocchio from Perugia to decorate his apartments in the Vatican, said Cavalcanti, and several rooms in Sant'Angelo. Pinocchio finished last year and left Rome. Perugino has frescoed the Borgia's sitting room, as well as the tower in the Papal Palace. Perugino was gone now too. What of marble? My friend Andrea Bregno is the most respected sculptor in Rome. He seems to have a monopoly on tomb carving. Runs a big shop with a number of apprentices. I should like to meet him. You'll find him an able man, a lightning-like worker who has decorated most of the churches. I'll tell him that you are coming in to see him." Balducci shared his countrymen's detestation of Rome, yet there was one phase of Roman life that he relished, the 7,000 public women, assembled from all parts of the world. The next Sunday, following their midday dinner at the Trattoria Toscana, Balducci took Michelangelo for a tour. He knew Rome's piazzas, fountains, forums, triumphal arches, temples, not for their historical background but for the nationality of the women who made these areas their headquarters. They walked the streets for hours peering into the faces, judging the figures beneath the glamour, while Balducci kept up a running fire of commentary on the virtues, drawbacks, pleasurable qualities of each. The Roman women, carrying parrots or monkeys on their shoulders, covered with jewelry and perfume and followed by their shiny black servants, arrogantly lorded it over the foreigners, the Spanish girls, with their jet black hair and eyes of great clarity, the tall Greek girls dressed in their native white robes buckled at slender waists, the dark-skinned Egyptian women in cloaks hanging straight down from the shoulders, the blue-eyed blondes from the north of Europe, with flowers twined through their braids, the straight-haired Turkish women, peering from behind veils, the slow-eyed Orientals swathed in yards of brightly colored silks. "I never take the same one twice," Balducci explained. "I like variety, contrast, different colors, shapes, personalities. That's the interesting part for me, like traveling around the world." "How can you tell, Balducci, that the first one you pass won't be the most attractive of the day?" "My innocent friend, it's the hunt that counts. That's why I prolong the search, until late at night sometimes. The externals are different, size, shape, mannerism. But the act, the same, largely the same, routine. It's the hunt that counts." Michelangelo was amused. His experience with Clarissa had given him no desire for a simulation of love with some strange hired woman, only a desire for Clarissa. "I'll wait for something better than routine." "For love?" "In a way. Che rigorista. I'm surprised to find an artist so conventional. I save all my unconventionality for my carving." He could go without carving so long as he was drawing with the sculpture in mind. But the weeks passed and no word came from Cardinal Riario. He applied to the appointment secretary several times, only to be put off. He understood that the Cardinal was busy, for next to the Pope he was said to be the richest man in Europe, running a banking and commercial empire comparable to Lorenzo de' Medici's. Michelangelo never saw the man perform a religious service, but Leo volunteered that he set his offices in the palace chapel early in the morning. Finally Leo arranged an appointment. Michelangelo carried a folio of sketches. Cardinal Riario appeared pleased to see him, though mildly surprised that he was still in Rome. He was in his office, surrounded by ledgers, the bookkeepers and scriveners with whom Michelangelo had been eating several times a week, but with whom he had not become friends. They stood at tall desks and did not look up from their work. When Michelangelo asked if the Cardinal had decided what he might like to see sculptured from the 7-foot block, Riario replied, "We will think about it. All in good time. In the meanwhile, Rome is a wonderful place for a young man. There are few pleasures of the world that we have not developed here. And now we must be excused." Michelangelo walked slowly down the broad staircase to the unfinished courtyard, his chin burrowing into his chest. Apparently he was in the same position as he had been with Piero de' Medici. Once one was under the roof of those gentlemen they were content, nothing further needed to be done. Waiting for him in his room was a gaunt figure in black mantle over a white habit, eyes sunken, looking hungry and exhausted. "Leonardo, what are you doing in Rome? How did you leave our family?" "I have seen no one," said Leonardo coldly. "I was sent on a mission by Savonarola to Arezzo and Perugia. Now I go back to Viterbo to discipline a monastery there." "When did you eat last?" "You may give me a florin to take me to Viterbo." Michelangelo dug into his money pouch, handed Leonardo a gold coin. He took it without change of expression. "Don't you say thank you. Michelangelo asked, nettled. For money you give to God? You are helping in his work. In return you will have a chance for salvation. He had barely recovered from his surprise at seeing Leonardo when a letter arrived from his father, brought in by the weekly mail courier from Florence. Lodovico was writing in a high state of perturbation, for he had fallen into debt over a supply of textiles and the mercer was threatening to take him into court. Michelangelo turned the sheet over several times, searching amidst the news of his stepmother, brothers, aunt and uncle for some clue as to how much the mercer was demanding, and how Lodovico had fallen into debt to him in the first place. There was no clue. Only the entreaty, "Send me some money." He had been anxious to settle down to a steady project because of his need for a consuming work. Now the time had come to face his money situation. He still did not know how much Cardinal Riario was going to pay him for his sculpture. "How could His Eminence decide," Leo replied tartly to his question, "when he doesn't know what you are going to carve or how good it will be?" He had been provided with drawing material and models, and it had cost him nothing to live in the palace, yet the few florins he had saved out from the Popolino's payment for the street John were gone. He had been eating with Balducci several times a week at the Florentine restaurant, and had had to buy an occasional shirt or pair of stockings for his visits to the Florentine homes, as well as a warm robe for the coming winter. The 30 florins he had brought to Rome to buy back his bambino were lightening in his pouch. It appeared that he would have no cash payment from the Cardinal until his sculpture was completed, and that would be many months away. He counted his florins. There were 26. He took 13 of them to Jacopo Galli's bank, asked Balducci to send a credit draft to Galli's correspondent in Florence. He then returned to his workshop and sat down in deadly earnest to conceive a theme that would compel Cardinal Riario to order. Not knowing whether the man would prefer a religious or antique subject, he planned to prepare one of each. It took a month to evolve, in rough wax, a full-bodied Apollo, inspired by the magnificent torso in the Cardinal Rovier's garden, and a Pieta which was a projection of his earlier Madonna and Child, at the end of the journey rather than the beginning. He wrote the Cardinal a note, telling him that he had 2 models ready for His Eminence to choose from. There was no reply. He wrote again, this time asking for an appointment. No answer came. He walked to Leo's house, interrupted his friend at supper with a beautiful woman, and was unceremoniously thrown out. Leo came by the next morning, urbane as usual, promised to speak to Riario. The days passed, and the weeks, while Michelangelo sat by, staring at the marble block, aching to get his hand on it. What reason does he give? He stormed at Leo. I need only 1 minute to let him choose between the themes. Cardinals don't have to give reasons, replied Leo. Patience. The days of my life are going by, groaned Michelangelo, and all I get to carve out of time is a block of patience. He could get no appointment with the Cardinal. Leo explained that Riario was worried about a fleet of ships long overdue from the Orient and had no stomach for art. All he could do, according to Leo, was pray that the Cardinal's ships would come up the Tiber. From the sheer hunger to carve he went to see Andrea Bregno. Bregno was from Como, in northern Italy, a white-black man of 75. He stood in the middle of a large stable belonging to an ancient palace which he had converted into the most active sculpture studio in Rome by ripping out 2 of every 3 stalls, erecting workbenches, and putting a northern Italian apprentice into each of the expanded stalls. Before going to the studio Michelangelo had stopped to see Bregno's altars and sarcophagi in Santa Maria del Popolo and Santa Maria Sopra Minerva. Bregno was prolific, had taste, proficiency in the classical style, and was good at carving decorative reliefs. But he had no more inventiveness than a cat, no idea of creating illusion in carving, perspective, the dimension of depth. He could do anything he thought of with hammer and chisel, but he never carved anything that he had not already seen carved. When he needed new themes he searched for old Roman tombs and copied the patterns. Bregno welcomed him cordially when Michelangelo told him that he was from Settignano. The old man's speech and manner were staccato, the only evidence of age the maze of wrinkles on his parchment-like face. I did the earliest Riario tomb with Mino da Fesole. He was an exquisite carver, made the loveliest cherubs. Since you come from his neighborhood, you are as good as Mino? Perhaps. I can always use helpers. You see here, I have just finished this tabernacle for Santa Maria della Quercia in Viterbo. Now we are working on this Sabli monument for Santa Maria in Ercole. I did my apprenticeship for a silversmith, so we are never rushed and never late because I know within a matter of minutes how long each panel of fruit or spray of leaves will take to carve. I run my bottega like a silversmith's shop. But suppose you run into something new, Messer Bregno, an idea not carved before? Bregno stopped short, wagged his left hand back and forth in front of him. Sculpture is not an inventing art, it is reproductive. If I tried to make up designs, this studio would be in chaos. We carve here what others have carved before us. You carve it well, said Michelangelo, glancing about at the many projects in work. Superbly. I have never had a rejection in half a century. Very early in my career I learned to accept the convention, what is, must continue to be. This wisdom of mine, Buonarotti, has paid me a fortune. If you want to be successful in Rome you must give the people exactly what they have grown up with. What would happen to a sculptor who said to himself, what is, must be changed? Changed? For the sake of change? No, because he felt that each new piece he carved had to break through the existing conventions, achieve something fresh and different. Bregno moved his jaws in a chewing movement, as though trying to pulverize this concept with his teeth. After a moment he spat into the sawdust underfoot, put a paternal hand on Michelangelo's shoulder. That is a youth speaking, my boy. A few months under my tutelage and you would lose such foolish notions. I might be willing to apprentice you for 2 years, 5 ducats the first, 10 the second. Messer Bregno, I have already served a 3-year apprenticeship under Bertoldo, in the Medici sculpture garden of Florence. Bertoldo, who worked for Donatello. The same. Too bad. Donatello has ruined sculpture for all you Florentines. However, we have quantities of angels to be carved on the tombs. The windswept trains of November brought with them the departure of Piero de' Medici with troops to reconquer his empire, and Buonarroti's arrival. The rain had driven Michelangelo indoors to his bedroom, where he was drawing by lamplight on an ash-gray afternoon, when his brother appeared, drenched but with a happy smile lighting his small dark features. He embraced Michelangelo. I finished my apprenticeship and just couldn't bear Florence without you. I have come to look for work at the Wall Guild here. Michelangelo was warmed by Buonarroti's affection. Come, get into dry clothes. When the rain stops I'll take you over to the Bear Hotel. I can't stay here? Asked Buonarroti wistfully. Michelangelo glanced at the narrow monk-like cot, the single chair. I'm only a guest. The Bear Inn is comfortable. Tell me quickly about father and the mercer's suit. Quiet for the moment, thanks to your 13 florins. But Consiglio claims that father owes him much more money. Father ordered the textiles, all right, but what he intended to do with them, not even Lucrezia can find out. While Buonarroti changed into Michelangelo's dry shirt, drawers and warm wool stockings related the happenings of the last 5 months, Uncle Francesco had been ill, Lucrezia too had been bedded, apparently with a miscarriage. With nothing coming in except the rent from the Settignano farm, Lodovico could not meet his bills. He worried about finances night and day. Giovan Simone had refused Lodovico's entreaties to contribute to the family coffers. Buonarroti rented a bed at the Baron. The brothers ate their suppers together at the trattoria. By the end of the week it was plain that there was no work for Buonarroti in Rome. The Florentines had no wool guild here, and the Romans would not hire Florentine. "I think you must return home," said Michelangelo regretfully. "If his 4 oldest sons are away, contributing nothing, how will father manage?" Buonarroti departed amidst a downpour. Piero de' Medici arrived back in Rome equally rain-soaked. The last remnants of his army were scattered. He was without funds, deserted even by the Orsini. He carried on his person a list of the families in Florence he was going to crush once he had regained power. Alfonsina had settled with her children in one of her ancestral homes. From here Piero scandalized Rome by his heavy gambling losses and violent quarrels in public with his brother Giovanni. He spent his mornings at the San Severino Palace, then passed the hours until dark with his favorite courtesan of the moment. At night he went into the streets of Rome to take part in every evil the city offered, crawling back at daybreak to Alfonsino's palace. Equally bad, from the viewpoint of the Florentine colony, was his arrogance and tyranny. He announced that he would govern Florence by himself, without the help of any council, because I prefer to manage badly on my own account than well by others' help. Michelangelo was surprised to have delivered to him an invitation written by Piero to attend Christmas dinner at Cardinal Giovanni's. The party was a lavish one. Giovanni's house was beautiful with the objects he had brought from Florence on his first trip: Medici paintings, bronzes, tapestries and silver plate, all pledged, at 20% interest, to cover Piero's debts, so that now, as the Florentine bankers commented, every florin the Medici spent costs them 8 lire. Michelangelo was shocked to see the ravages of Piero's life. His left eyelid was almost closed, white patches of scalp showed through where clumps of hair had fallen out. The once handsome face was bloated and red-veined. "Buonarroti," cried Piero. "I felt in baloney that you were disloyal to the Medici. But I have learned from my sister Contessina that you saved many valuable gems and works of art at the palace." "I was fortunate to have the opportunity, Excellency." Piero imperiously raised his right arm. His voice was loud enough for everyone in the drawing-room to hear. "In return for your loyalty, Buonarroti, I commission you to do me a marble." "That would make me happy, Excellency," replied Michelangelo quietly. "A large statue," continued Piero loftily. "Better make it small," contributed Giovanni, his plump face twisted in a deprecatory smile. "My brother seems to be moving around a lot, and he couldn't carry a life-size Hercules under his arm." Piero waved his brother's words aside. "I will send for you shortly. At that time, I shall give you my orders. I will await word." On the way home from the tension-filled evening he caught his first glimpse of Torrigiani. He was with a group of young Romans, richly dressed and camlet with gold braid, his handsome face wreathed in laughter as he walked down the street, arms thrown affectionately about the shoulders of his companions, all of them full of wine and good cheer, roaring with laughter at Torrigiani's performance. Michelangelo felt ill. He asked himself if what he was feeling was fear. Yet he knew that it was something more, something in his experience akin to the sacking of the Medici palace, the deterioration of Piero, an awareness of the senseless destructiveness that lay inherent in time and space, ready to lash out and destroy. Cardinal Riario's ships at last reached the right-headed docks. Leo angled an invitation for Michelangelo to a New Year's reception. "I'll get a couple of collapsible black boxes lined with velvet," he explained, "the kind the jewelry people use to display the airs and crowns. We will put in your 2 clay models. When the cardinal is surrounded by people he likes to impress, I'll give you the signal." And so he did. Cardinal Riario was surrounded by the princes of the church, the Pope, his sons Juan and Caesar, Lucrezia and her husband, cardinals, bishops, the noble families of Rome, the women in gowns of silk and velvet with lavish jewelry. Lau turned to Riario and said, "Buonarrotti has been making sculpture models for you to choose between, your grace." Michelangelo set the black boxes on a table, released the springs and let the sides fall away. He took one of his models in the palm of each hand, extending them for the cardinal to see. There was a murmur of pleasure from the men, while the women clapped their gloved hands discreetly. "Excellent! Excellent!" cried the cardinal, looking at the models. "Keep working, my dear boy, and soon we'll have the one we want." Michelangelo asked hoarsely, "Then your grace would not have me carve either of these in marble?" Cardinal Riario turned to Leo. "Bring your friend to me as soon as he has new models. I'm sure they will be exquisite." Outside the reception room, Michelangelo's anger stormed in torrential words. "What kind of man is that? He's the one who asked me to carve something, who bought the marble for me. I have a living to make. I could be here for months, for years, and not be allowed to touch that block." Leo was despondent. "I thought he might like to flatter his guests by letting them choose. That's a fine way to decide what is to be carved out of a 7-foot column of Carrara marble. But better than no decision at all. I'm sorry." Michelangelo became contrite. "Forgive my bitterness. I've spoiled your day. Go back to the reception." Alone, he walked the streets, crowded now with families and children out to celebrate the holiday. From the Pinchot Hill fireworks of radiating rockets and revolving wheels burst into the air. Soggy was right. Sculpture was on the bottom of everybody's list. He would wander like a peddler singing, "Who wants an Apollo? A Pieta? Time," he muttered to himself. "Everybody wants me to give them time. But time is as empty as space unless I can fill it with figures." He went into a black funk, unable to speak civilly to anyone. Balducci found a golden-haired Florentine girl to help bring him out of his melancholy. Michelangelo smiled for the first time since he had left Cardinal Riario's reception. "Ah, Balducci, if life were as simple as you conceive it." In the Trattoria Toscana they came upon Giuliano da Sangat, the Florentine architect, friend of Lorenzo, and the first man to instruct Michelangelo in the art of architecture. The luxuriant long golden mustaches still rolled down the sides of his mouth, but he looked lonely. He had had to leave his wife and son behind in Florence while he lived in rented rooms in Rome, waiting for better commissions than his present job of building a wooden ceiling for Santa Maria Maggiore, overlaying it with the first gold brought from America by Columbus. He invited Michelangelo and Balducci to join him, asked Michelangelo how things were going for him here in Rome, listening intently while the younger man spilled out his frustration. "You are in the service of the wrong cardinal," Sangallo concluded. It was Cardinal Rovere who came to Florence in 1481 to commission Galatea, Botticelli and Rosselli to paint murals for his uncle Sixtus IV's chapel. It was he who persuaded Sixtus to start the first public library in Rome, and to assemble the Capitoline Museum of Bronzes. When Cardinal Rovere returns to Rome, I shall introduce you. Heartened, Michelangelo asked, "When does he return?" "He is in Paris now. He is bitter about the Borgia, and has stayed away for several years. But there is every indication that he will be the next pope. Tomorrow I will come for you and show you the Rome I like best, not this stinking shambles of today, but the Rome of grandeur, when the world's greatest architects built here, the Rome I shall recreate stone upon stone once Cardinal Rovere becomes Pope. By tomorrow night you'll forget you wanted to sculpture, and give yourself over to architecture. It was a needed diversion. Sangallo wanted them to start first with the Pantheon because it was to the top of this magnificent Roman vaulted structure that Brunelleschi had climbed to learn an architectural secret forgotten for 1500 years, that this was not one dome, but two, built one inside the other, the two domes interlaced structurally. With this revelation of Roman genius from 27 BC, Brunelleschi had been able to return to Florence and apply the idea to closing the dome of the cathedral, which had stood open for more than 100 years. Sangallo handed Michelangelo a block of architectural paper, exclaimed, "Very well, now we recreate the Pantheon as the Romans of the time of Augustus saw it." First they sketched inside, re-establishing the marble-faced interior, with the opening to the sky at the center of the dome. They moved outside, drew the 16 red and gray granite columns holding up the portico, the giant bronze doors, the dome covered with bronze tiles, the vast brick circular structure as the historians had described it. Then with paper pads under their arms they made their way to the Via del Bottega, and climbed up the Capitoline Hill. Here, overlooking the great Roman Forum, they were at the heart of the early Roman capital. Now it was a rubble heap with rough earthen mounds on which goats and swine were grazing, yet here on the two summits had been the Temple of Jupiter and the Temple of Juno Moneta, from the 6th century BC. While Sangallo talked about the roof of the Temple of Jupiter, bronze overlaid thickly with gold, as described by Dionysius of Halicarnassus, then about the 3 rows of columns on the front, the single row on each side, the inside consisting of 3 parallel shrines to Jupiter, Juno and Minerva, they brought the structure to life on their paper. Plutarch had described the 4th temple of Domitian, slender pillars of Pentelic marble, the buildings of tremendous rustic stone, on the portico enthroned statues before which the emperors and magistrates had made their sacrifices to the gods. All this they sketched. They scrambled down the side of the hill to the Roman Forum, spent the remainder of their hours here, drawing the buildings as they had been in the days of their greatness, the temples of Saturn and Vespasian, the Senate house of Julius Caesar, built of severely plain yellow brick, the great column Castor's temple with its rich Corinthian capitals, then on through the Arch of Titus to the Colosseum. Michelangelo's hands flying faster than they ever had in his life, trying to keep up with Sangallo, who was pouring out a stream of sketches and verbal descriptions. Night fell. Michelangelo was exhausted, Sangallo triumphant. "Now you have uncovered the glory that was Rome. Work in it every day. Go up to the Palatine and reconstruct the baths of Severus, Flavian's palace. Go to the Circus Maximus, the Basilica of Constantino, the Golden House of Nero at the bottom of the Esquiline. The Romans were the greatest architects the world has known." Michelangelo glanced at Sangallo's mobile, attractive face, the excitement glowing in his eyes. Sangallo has old Roman architecture to make his days important, Balducci his girls. "And I could use a sculpture commission," he murmured to himself. Deep in his bosom was the growing doubt that he would ever get Cardinal Riario's approval to carve the 7-foot block. In desperation he sought out Piero at the Orsini Palace. He would suggest only a small, attractive piece to increase his chance of acceptance. Piero was in the midst of an uproarious quarrel with the servants over the way they had cooked his dinner. Alfonsina sat opposite him at the huge oak table. Her tired eyes gave him a brief flash of recognition. "Excellency, I have the time now to make you a beautiful sculpture, if you would give me the order to commence." Piero was half awake. Do you not recall? At your Christmas reception you ordered. What about it? I have a design for a Cupid, if you think that would please you. A Cupid? Well, why not? I only needed your approval. Piero had started shouting again. Michelangelo knew that he had been dismissed, but he had also been told to go ahead. He walked along the riverbank to the stone yards by the docks on the Tiber, saw a small block, paid 5 florins from his dwindling supply, and trudged behind the barrow as a boy wheeled it home for him. It took him 2 days to find out that the marble was bad. He had acted stupidly, walked into a yard and bought the first block that looked good to him. He never would have done such a thing in Florence. But here in Rome he had behaved like a novice. His 5 florins were thrown away. The next morning at dawn he was in the yard of the Guffati, from whom Cardinal Riario had bought the 7-foot column. Now he tested the blocks, at length found a white marble that looked translucent in the early rays of the sun, that showed no gullies or fissures when under water. This time he had invested his 5 florins well, but his purse was reduced to a last 3 florins. He sketched for a morning in the workingmen's quarter in Trastevere, children playing in the streets, lying on pallets in front of the clanging metal shops. It was only a matter of days before he had his hammer and chisel raised for the first blows. Balducci asked, "Hadn't you better get a signed commitment from Piero? He's pouring every florin he can commandeer into mercenaries to mount another attack on Florence." Piero was not having any contracts. "My dear Buonarrotti, I'll be leaving Rome before you can finish this Cupid. In all likelihood I'll never be back." "Are you telling me, Excellency, that you have changed your mind?" His need had put a sharp edge to his tongue. "A Medici never changes his mind," said Piero coldly. "It's just that I'm preoccupied. Postpone the matter for a year." Out in the freezing Piazza Sant'Apollinare, Michelangelo cried, "It serves me right." He had said it out loud, his voice bitter, his face contorted with disgust. Only his eagerness to begin a piece for someone could have considered Piero's flimsy agreement a commitment. He carved the Cupid anyway, for the joy of working in the white marble and breathing its dust. 2 frustrating months passed before he could get another appointment with Cardinal Riario. "What have you got for me today?" he asked in good humor. "Something vigorously pagan, to match those fine antiques in the Cardinal Rovier's garden?" Michelangelo lied quickly. "Yes, your grace." He sat on the bed in his narrow room with the sweat pouring off him as though he had a fever, searching his mind for the most totally joyous, pleasure-giving Greek god he could find. In this Florentine quarter one night, Altaviti had asked, "Have you ever thought of doing a Bacchus?" "No, I rarely drink wine." Bacchus is also Dionysus, a nature god, symbolizing fruitfulness. He is the god who brought strange and wondrous gifts to man, enabling him to forget his misery, drudgery, the brute tragedy of life. If it is good for man to have pleasure, to laugh, sing, be happy, then we owe much to Bacchus. Into his memory came a youth he had seen at the baths, with the proportioned body of an athlete, slim legs and waist, powerfully muscled chest and arms, panther-like. His work was his only reward. On Good Friday violence broke out in Rome, the cobblestones of the city running with blood. It started with a riot incited by the Pope's Spanish mercenaries, who were so bitterly hated by the Romans that they fought the armed soldiers with clubs and stones, moved on to Lucrezia Borgia's husband, Sforza, fleeing Rome after announcing that the Borgias were about to murder him because they wanted a Spanish alliance for Lucrezia, moved on to another departure of Piero de' Medici at the head of an army of 1,300 mercenaries to storm Florence, moved on to revolt in the Florentine quarter when the Pope excommunicated Savonarola, and ended in the grisly murder of Juan Borgia. Fishermen angling in the Tiber found Juan Borgia's body and brought it ashore, still dressed in velvet coat and mantle, boots and spurs, slashed with 9 knife wounds, the hands hide. The Romans did little to conceal their joy. A reign of terror settled over Rome. The Vatican and the city were paralyzed. The Pope's police forced their way into every house one had ever visited, tortured servants in their search for clues, ransacked the homes of the Florentines to prove a conspiracy, accused Lucrez's rejected husband of the murder, then every noble Roman family that had ever fought the papacy. Until word got around that the Pope, along with the rest of Rome, was convinced that Caesar had killed his older brother to get him out of the way of his own career. Cardinal Riario went into mourning with his pope. The palace was closed to all but the most compelling business. Sculpture was far from compelling business. It was a luxury to be abandoned the moment anything went wrong. "The cardinal won't talk sculpture for a long time," said Leo Bagliani. "I would advise you to look for another patron." In Rome? Won't Cardinal Riario's attitude be reflected all over the city? Unfortunately, yes. But is Florence any better under Savonarola? Number. But it's home. Could you arrange one last appointment? So that I can get paid. Paid? You haven't made a sculpture. I've worked. I've made drawings, models. But you wouldn't let me begin carving. The cardinal is a rich man, and I'm down to my last denarii. He tossed on his bed through the night, was cranky when Balducci insisted that he come with him to hunt ducks in the marshes. "The air will be good for you. Make a man of you." I spent every spare hour tramping and shooting to keep up my manhood. Michelangelo knew what Balducci meant by his manhood. He said satirically, building up a coin of the realm to spend on the women. "But of course," cried Balducci, "every man builds up his fortune to spend somewhere. Troubles all come ripe at the same time, like tomatoes." Leonardo showed up again, his habit torn, blood on his face. From his incoherent story, Michelangelo gathered that the monks at Viterbo had turned on him, beaten him and ejected him from the monastery for his championing of the excommunicated Savonarola. "I want to get home to San Marco," he said hoarsely, licking his cracked lips. "Give me money for the journey." Michelangelo took his last coins out of the leather pouch. "I, too, feel badly beaten. My hope is also to get home. But stay here with me for a few days, until you feel better." "Thank you, no, Michelangelo. And thank you for the money." It was the first softness Michelangelo had heard in his brother's voice in years. The second blow was the news of his stepmother Lucrez's death, written in a few broken sentences by his father. "Il migliore," he thought with affection, "the best." She had bought only the best, and given of her best to all of them, the 9 Buonarotti she had undertaken to feed. Had Lodovico loved her? It was hard to say. Had she loved them? This big family into which she had moved as a second wife? Yes, she had. It was not her fault if her only talent or excitement was for cooking. She had given unstintingly of what she had, and her stepson shed a tear for her passing. A few days later a hotel groom brought a note from the Bear Inn announcing that Buonarrotti was back. He hurried over, past the city market in Piazza Navona, the factories and shops between the ruined theatre of Pompey and stadium of Domitian, the vegetable gardens leading to Piazza Sant'Apollinare. "What of father?" demanded Michelangelo. "How has he taken Lucrez's death?" "Badly. Locks himself in his bedroom. We must find him another wife. He says he would rather live alone than go through another death." He paused, then added, "The mercer is about to have him arrested for the bad debt. Consiglio can prove that father took the goods, and since we have only a few florins left it could mean prison. Prison. Dio mio. He must sell the Settignano villa and farm. He can't. It's under long-term lease. Besides, he says he would rather go to the stench than deprive us of our last inheritance. Michelangelo was furious. Our last inheritance, a house? Our last inheritance is the Buonarotti name. We've got to protect it. But what to do? I'd earn only a few scudi a month. And I earn nothing. But I will. I'll make Cardinal Riario see the justice of my position. The Cardinal listened, playing quietly with the long gold chain around his neck. I would not expect you to have given this time for nothing. Thank you, Excellency, I knew you would be generous. Indeed I shall. I relinquish all right and title to the marble block and the 37 ducats it cost me. The marble is yours, in return for patient waiting. He had only one recourse, the Florentine bankers, Russell and Cavalcanti. He would go into debt. He sat down and wrote his father a letter telling him, I shall send you whatever you ask me, even if I should have to sell myself as a slave, then went to Paolo Russell to explain his plight. A loan from the bank? No, it is too expensive for you at 20% interest. From me, yes, as a personal loan without interest. Will 25 florins help? I will pay it back, you will see. You are to forget about it until you have money in your belt. He ran through the labyrinth of unpaved streets crowded with heavy traffic and clogged with sand from the river, gave Buonarotti the credit slip signed by Russell, added to it a note to Consiglio stating that he would take responsibility for the balance of the debt, guaranteeing to pay it within the year. That's what father wanted, of course, Buonarotti said thoughtfully, fingering the two notes. He's not going to earn anything more, nor is Uncle Francesco. You and me, we are the Buonarotti now. We can expect no help from Leonardo or Giovansimone. And the little one, Sigismundo. The wine guild has released him. Once father sees these papers you will have the support of the Buonarotti family on your hands. Good fortune comes in bunches, as do peaches when the trees turn ripe. Michelangelo finished polishing his Cupid, a lovely child just awakened from sleep and holding up its arms to be taken by his mother. Balducci was enchanted with its light-hearted warmth, the beautiful satiny texture. He asked if they could carry it to the Galli house to show his boss, Jacopo Galli. There was no bugatti need to wheel the marble through the streets. Balducci rented a mule with a large saddlebag. Michelangelo wrapped his Cupid in a blanket, led the animal past San Lorenzo and Damaso, through the lane of Lentari and Parian. The Cossack Galli had been built by one of Jacopo Galli's ancestors. Galli was grateful to this predecessor because he had begun, at the same time, a collection of ancient sculptures that was second only to the Cardinal Rovier's. Balducci tied the mule while Michelangelo unwrapped the Cupid. After descending a broad flight of stone stairs, Michelangelo found himself in an atrium, closed on three sides by the house, and on the fourth by the flight of steps, giving the area the illusion of being a sunken garden, or, Michelangelo thought as he glanced hastily about him, a sunken wilderness of statues, marble friezes, crouching animals. Jacopo Galli, who had been educated at the university in Rome, and had been reading every day of his life since, put down a copy of Aristophanes' Frogs, began pulling himself out of a low-lying chaise. He seemed never to stop getting up as he unfolded, 6 feet, 6.5, surely not 7. The tallest man Michelangelo had ever seen, hunched over at the shoulders from a lifetime of stooping to the short-statured Romans. Michelangelo was as a child before him. Ah, you come with the marble in your arms. That is the sight I like best in my garden. Michelangelo set the Cupid down on the table next to Galli's book, turned to look up into the man's blue eyes. "I'm afraid I've brought my Cupid into a rough arena." "I think not," murmured Galli in a voice that he made an effort to keep reasonable-sized. "Balducci, take your friend Buonarrotti into the house for a slice of cold watermelon." When they returned to the garden a few minutes later, they found that Galli had removed a torso from a pedestal on the low wall next to the steps and replaced it with the Cupid. He had settled back into the chaise. Standing behind his host, Michelangelo had an opportunity to study the three Greek torsos: Roman sarcophagus, temple frieze, wall slab with huge seated griffin, Egyptian lion with near-human head. Galli's eyes were twinkling. "I feel as though your Cupid has been sitting there since the day I was born, a lineal descendant of any of these carvings. Would you sell it to me? What price shall we set?" Humbly, Michelangelo murmured, "That is up to you. First, tell me your circumstances." Michelangelo related the story of his year with Riario. "So you end up without a scudo of pay, and a 7-foot marble block? Shall we say the Cupid is worth 50 ducats? Because I know you need money, I will allow my cupidity to knock the price down to 25 ducats. Then, because I detest shrewdness and dealing with the arts, I will take the 25 ducats I was going to underpay you, and add them to my original estimate. Do you approve my formula?" Michelangelo's amber eyes shone. "Signor Galli, for year one have been thinking bad things about the Romans. In your name, I apologize to the whole city." Galli bowed while sitting down. "Now tell me about this 7-foot marble block. What do you think might be carved from that?" Michelangelo told him about his drawings for an Apollo, for a Pieta, for a Bacchus. Galli was intrigued. "I've never heard of a Bacchus unearthed hereabouts, though there are one or two that were brought from Greece, figures of old men with beards, rather dull. No, my Bacchus would be young, as befits a god of joy and fertility. Bring me the drawings tomorrow at 9. Galli brought a purse from the house and handed Michelangelo 75 ducats. Michelangelo led the mule through the darkening streets to the stable where he paid for his hire, then walked to Ruscelli's to return the 25 florins he had borrowed. The next evening he presented himself in the Galli garden at the appointed time. No one was present. It seemed as though hours passed. He saw himself abandoning his marble, or reselling it to Guffatti for a fraction of its cost and returning to Florence with the next pack train. Then Galli came into the garden, welcomed him, poured them an aperitif, and settled down to study the drawings. Soon Signora Galli, a tall, lithe woman, no longer young but preserving a patrician beauty, joined them for supper over candlelight. A cool breeze stirred the summer heat. When supper was over, Galli asked, "Would you be willing to move your block here, and carve this Bacchus for me? You could have a room to live in. I would pay you 300 ducats for the completed statue." Michelangelo bowed his head so that the candle gleam would not betray him. He had been saved from an ignominious return to Florence, from defeat. Yet the next morning when he walked alongside the Guffatti wagon carrying his marble column from the Riario palace to Galli's, with his small bag of clothes under his arm, he felt like a mendicant. Was he to spend his years moving from one charitable bedroom to another? He knew that many artists traveled from court to court, from patron to patron, for the most part well-housed, fed and entertained. But he also knew he would not be content to do so. He promised himself that one day soon he must become his own man, inside his own walls. He was shown into a bedroom on the wing of the U opposite from the one occupied by the Galli, a pleasant room warm with sunlight. A door on the far side admitted to a fig orchard. At the edge of the orchard was the storage shed with a hard earthen floor. Michelangelo took off the plank roof, letting the fig trees clothe it over in shade. The building backed onto a rear lane, through which friends could come and visit him and materials be delivered. He could not see the house through the trees, and he was far enough away so that they could not hear his hammering. On the outside he rigged up a barrel so that he could bring water from the well and shower at night before putting on clean clothes and joining the galley for supper in the garden. Jacopo Galli did not leave his bank at midday. No dinner was served except on Sundays and religious holidays. A servant brought Michelangelo a light meal on a tray, which he ate off his drafting board. He was grateful not to have to change clothes at midday, or be sociable. He had a letter from his father, acknowledging the 25 florins. The mercer had accepted Michelangelo's assurance of payment, but he wanted half of the 50 florins still owed him. Could he possibly send another 25 florins by the Saturday post? Michelangelo sighed, donned a lightweight blouse, took 25 ducats to Jacopo Galli's bank in the Piazza San Celso next to the bank of the Chigi family. Balducci was not in, so he went to Jacopo Galli's desk. Galli looked up, gave no sign of recognition. Nor did Michelangelo recognize Jacopo Galli. The face was stern, cold, expressionless. He asked in an impersonal tone what Michelangelo desired. A credit. For 25 florins. To send to Florence. He put his coins on the desk. Galli spoke to a clerk nearby. The transaction was swiftly made. Galli returned his masked eyes and hard-set mouth to his papers. Michelangelo was staggered. What have I done to offend? He demanded of himself. It was dark before he could bring himself to return to the house. From his room he saw lights in the garden. He opened the door gingerly. "Ah, there you are!" cried Galli. "Come have a glass of this fine Madeira." Jacopo Galli was sprawled relaxedly in his chaise. He asked whether Michelangelo had set up his shop, what more he would need. His change of manner was simply explained. Jacopo Galli apparently could not, or would not, establish a bridge between the halves of his life. At his bank he held himself rigid, brusque. His business associates admired the way in which he dispatched their affairs and brought them the most profitable result, but did not like him as a person. They said he was not human. When he reached home Galli shed his skin as though he were a lizard, was gay, indulgent, humorous. No word of business ever passed his lips. Here in the garden he talked art, literature, history, philosophy. The friends who dropped in each evening loved him, considered him overgenerous with his family and household. For the first time since he reached Rome, Michelangelo began to meet interesting Romans. Peter Sabinus, professor of eloquence at the university, who cared little for Galli's sculptures but who had what Galli described as an incredible number of early Christian inscriptions. The collector Giovanni Capocci, one of the first Romans to attempt disciplined excavating at the catacombs, Pomponius Letus, one of Galli's old professors, an illegitimate son of the powerful Sanseverino family, who could have dawdled in idle elegance but lived only for learning, ill-clad in buckskins and housed in a shack. "I used to go to his lecture hall at midnight to get a seat," Galli told Michelangelo. "Then we'd wait for dawn, until we saw him coming down the hill, lantern in one hand, old manuscript in the other. He was tortured by the Inquisition because our academy, like your Plato Academy in Florence, was suspected of heresy, paganism, republicanism." Galli chuckled. "All perfectly true charges. Pomponius is so steeped in paganism that the sight of an antique monument can move him to tears." Michelangelo suspected that Galli too was steeped in paganism, for he never saw a man of the church at Galli's, with the exception of the blind brothers, Aurelius and Raphael Lippus, Augustinians from Santo Spirito in Florence, who improvised Latin songs and poetic hymns on their lyres, and the French Jean Villient de la Groslay, Cardinal of San Dionigi, a wisp of a man in an elegantly trimmed white beard and scarlet cassock, who had begun his religious life as a Benedictine monk and, beloved by Charles VIII for his devoutness and learning, had been made a cardinal through the king's intervention. He had nothing to do with the corruption of the Borgias, living the same devout life in Rome that he had in the Benedictine monasteries, continuing his studies of the Church Fathers, on whom he was an authority. Not all the scholars were aged. He made friends with Jacopo Saioldo from Ferrara, 20 years old, a fine poet and Latinist, Serafino, an idolized poet in the court of Lucrezia Borgia, who never mentioned the Borgias or the Vatican when he visited as galleys, but read his historical poems while he accompanied himself on the lute, San Nazaro, 40, but seeming 30, who mingled pagan and Christian images in his verse. The galley made the minimum number of gestures of conformity. They went to Mass most Sundays and on the important holy days. Jacopo Galli confided that his anti-clericalism was the only gesture he could make against the corruption of the Borgias and their followers. From my reading, Michelangelo, I have been able to follow the rise, fulfillment, decay and disappearance of many religions. That is what is happening to our religion today. Christianity has had 1500 years to prove itself, and has ended in what? Borgia murders, greed, incest, perversion of every tenet of our faith. Rome is more evil today than Sodom and Gomorrah when they were destroyed by fire. Even as Savonarola has said. As Savonarola has said, 100 years of Borgias and there will be nothing left here but a historic pile of stones. The Borgias can't rule for 100 years, can they? Galli's big, open face was greased by furrows. Caesar Borgia has just crowned Federico as King of Naples, returned to Rome in triumph, and been consigned his brother Juan's estate by the Pope. An archbishop has been caught forging dispensations. A bishop was caught with 10,000 ducats from the sale of offices in the Curia. And so it goes. Now all the drawings he had made for the Bacchus, the Greek god of joy, seemed superficial and cynical. He had tried to project himself backward into an Elysian age, but he was playing with a myth as a child plays with toys. His present reality was Rome, the Pope, Vatican, cardinals, bishops, the city plunged deep into corruption and decadence because the hierarchy battened off it. He felt a total revulsion for this Rome. But could he sculpture from hate? Could he use his pure white marble, which he loved, to depict the evil and smell of death that were destroying what had once been the capital of the world? Was there not a danger that his marble too would become hateful? He could not bring himself to abandon the Greek ideal of beauty out of marble. He slept fitfully. Often he went to Galli's library, lit a lamp and took up writing materials, as he had as Aldo Randi's after he had met Clarissa. It had been love that churned him then, made him pour out line to cool himself off. Now it was hate, as searing an emotion as love, that caused him to pour out hundreds of lines until, at dawn, he had had his say. Here helms and swords are made of chalices. The blood of Christ is sold so much thick bought. His cross and thorns are spears and shields. And short must be the time ere even his patience cease. Nay, let him come no more to raise the fees of this fool sacrilege beyond report. For Rome still flays and sells him at the court. Where paths are closed the virtues fair increase. God welcomes poverty perchance with pleasure. But of that better life what hope have we? When the blessed banner leads to naught but ill. He went searching through the collections in Rome for ancient carvings. The only young Bacchus he could find was about 15 years old, dead sober. From the way he held a bunch of grapes, Negligently, he seemed bored with the fact that he had conceived this strangest of fruits. His sculpture would have joy in it, try to capture the sense of fertility of Dionysus, the nature god, the power of the intoxicating drink that enabled a man to laugh and sing and forget for a while the sorrow of his earthly miseries. And then, perhaps, at the same time he could portray the decay that came with too much forgetfulness, that he saw all around him, when man surrendered his moral and spiritual values for the pleasures of the flesh. The Bacchus would be the central figure of his theme, a human being rather than a demigod. Then there would be a child of about 7, sweet-faced, lovable, nibbling from a bunch of grapes. His composition would have death in it too, the tiger, who liked wine and was loved by Bacchus, with the dead skin and head conceivable. He went to the baths to look for models, thinking he might put together a composite Bacchus as he had his Hercules from hundreds of Tuscans, a throat here, a forearm there, a belly in the next place. But when after a few weeks he welded his features together with hard silver pen, his composite portrait was not convincing. He took himself to Leo Bagliani. "I need a model. Young. Under 30. Of a high family. And a beautiful body? That once was, but is no longer. A figure that has been corrupted. By what? Wine. Sensuousness. Self-indulgence." Leo thought for a moment, flicking over in his mind the figures and features of the Roman youths he knew. "I may know your man. The Count Gonazzo. But he's wealthy, of a noble family. What can we offer him by way of inducement? Flattery. That he is to be immortalized as the great Greek god Bacchus. Or Dionysus, if he prefers. That might work. He's idle, and can give you his days. Or what's left of them after he awakens from his bacchanals of the night before." The Count was delighted with his new role. When he had walked through the orchard with Michelangelo, stripped off his clothes and taken the pose Michelangelo requested, he said, "You know, it's a coincidence my being selected for this. I've always thought of myself as a kind of god." Michelangelo went to his drawing board, sucked in his breath with pleasure. If he had searched all of Italy he could not have found a more fitting subject than Leo had selected for him, the head a bit too small for the body, the belly softer and fleshy, the buttocks too large for the torso, the upper arm a touch flaccid, the legs as straight and firmly molded as a Greek wrestler's. It was a figure desexed, the eyes unfocused from too much wine at dinner, the mouth dazedly half open, yet the arm that held the wine cup aloft flexed with muscular power, and over all a flawless satin smooth skin glistened in the strong frontal sunlight that made him appear illumined from within. "You're perfect!" Michelangelo cried impulsively. "Bacchus to the very life." "Delighted you think so," said Count Gonazzo without turning his head. "When Leo first proposed serving as a model I told him not to be a bore. But this may prove to be interesting. What time can I expect you tomorrow? And don't hesitate to bring your wine with you. That makes everything splendid. I can remain the entire afternoon. Without wine, the day is so dull." "You will never appear dull to me, Messieurs. I will see you in a new light every minute." He cast the man in 100 poses, his right leg bent sharply at the knee, toes barely touching the rough wooden base, the body slumped over on one leg, striving to stand up, the torso leaning backward, the small head thrust forward, turned one way and another, moving slightly, satiated with pleasure. And in the late afternoons, when Gonazzo had drunk much wine, Michelangelo wound bunches of grapes through his hair, sketching him as though the grapes were growing there, which amused the Roman inordinately. Until one afternoon he drank too much of the wine, began to sway dizzily, fell off the wood block and hit his chin on the hard earth, knocking himself out. Michelangelo revived him by throwing a bucket of water over him. Count Gonazzo shivered into his clothes, disappeared through the orchard and from Michelangelo's life. Jacopo Galli found him a lively boy of 7, with curling golden hair and large tender eyes, a delightful lad with whom Michelangelo made friends as he sketched. His only problem was to get the boy to maintain the difficult pose of holding his left arm in a contrapposto position against his chest, so that he could crush the bunch of grapes in his mouth. Next he went into the countryside, spending a whole day drawing the legs, hoofs and curling fur of the goats cropping the hillsides. That was how his pen finally designed his sculpture. In the center the weak, confused, arrogant, soon-to-be-destroyed young man holding cup aloft, behind him the idyllic child, clear-eyed, munching his grapes, symbol of joy, between them the tiger's skin. The Bacchus, hollow within himself, flabby, reeling, already old, the satyr, eternally young and gay, symbol of man's childhood and naughty innocence. Sunday morning he invited Galli to the workshop to show him his drawing, the bowl held high in Bacchus' hand, the intertwined grapes and leaves that made up his hair, and long, curving bunch of grapes that formed a structural bond between the Bacchus and the satyr, the tree trunk on which the Bacchus leaned and the satyr would be sitting, and lastly the tiger skin held in the Bacchus' falling hand, winding down through the satyr's arm, its head hanging between the satyr's open, stanced goat's hooves. The hollow tiger held a picturization of what would happen to the Bacchus head, ere long. Galli asked countless questions. Michelangelo explained that he would do some wax or clay modeling, some carving on scrap marble to test the component parts, the way the satyr's head rests against the Bacchus arm, for instance, and the way the boy's thigh melts into the furry leg of the satyr. Exactly. Galli was fascinated. "I don't know how to thank you." Michelangelo laughed a little embarrassedly. "There is one way. Could you send some florins to Florence?" Galli hunched his huge shoulders over Michelangelo protectively. "Would you like our correspondent in Florence to deliver a few florins each month to your father, I mean regularly? Then you won't be distressed each time a packet of mail arrives. It will cost you no more that way, and will keep a record for you against the commission price." "It isn't his fault, really," Michelangelo proffered, his pride hurt. "My uncle is ill, there are some debts." He lowered his column to a horizontal position on the ground, secured it on tightly wedged beams, then, using a point, bit into the corner where the wine cup would emerge. He concentrated on the frontal view, then started to join up the two sides to establish the visual flow. After heading for the high points of the fingers of the hand holding the cup, and the extended right kneecap, he struck in between to find the stomach, to establish the relationships between the highest projections and the deepest penetration. The intermediary forms would follow a natural sequence, as the forms of the side and back would take their cue from the front. He masked about the upper torso to indicate the reeling position of the upright figure, then turned the block over clockwise so that he could work on the width plane, roughing out the cup arm which was in the key position. He summoned one of the Guffati to help him set the column vertical again. Now the marble presented its personality, its size, proportion, weight. He sat in front of the block, studied it concentratedly, allowed it to speak, to establish its own demands. Now, he felt fear, as though he were meeting an unknown person. To sculpture is to remove marble, it is also to probe, dig, sweat, think, feel and live with it until it is completed. Half the original weight of this block would remain in the finished statue, the rest would lie out in the orchard in chips and dust. His one regret was that he would sometimes have to eat and sleep, painful breaks when his work must stop. The weeks and months of uninterrupted carving flowed by in a continuous stream. The winter was mild, He did not have to put back the roof of the shed. When the weather was sharp he wore his wool hat with its earmuffs, and a warm tunic. Thoughts, feelings, perceptions often came in a flash as the Bacchus and satyr began to emerge, but to express these ideas in marble took days and weeks. Inside himself he had to grow as his sculpture grew and matured. The unfinished block haunted him at every hour of the night and day. It would be dangerous to release the ball and the flexed knee in space. He would have to keep a webbing of marble between the outstretched ball and forearm, between the knee and elbow, between the base and knee to give them support while he dug deeper. Now he was chiseling the side plane, the face and head, part of the neck and curls of grapes, now the depth of the left shoulder, thigh and calf. At the rear he evolved the satyr, the stump he was sitting on, the grapes he was eating, the tiger cloth tying the two figures together. It was the most complicated piece he had yet attempted. He turned the satyr's head, arms and grapes adroitly to the Bacchus arm, yet ran out of marble. His real battle began the moment a muscle became defined or a structural element began to emerge. Standing out from the rough blocking, he felt a thumping in his heart to shed away quickly the rest of the marble skin to reveal the human form below. The marble was tenacious. He was equally tenacious to achieve the delicate play of muscle under the fleshy stomach, the soft, clay-like trunk of the tree, the spiral torsion of the satyr, the grapes on the Bacchus head which seemed to be part of the vine of his hair. Each completed detail brought peacefulness to all of the faculties he had used in its creation, not only to his eyes and mind and bosom, but to his shoulders, hips and groin. When unable to formulate a detail he dropped his tools, walked outside and gazed up through the trees to the skies. When he returned he approached the marble from a distance, saw its contours and masses, felt its continuity. The detail became part of the whole. He grabbed his tools again and worked furiously, 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 strokes, then 1 2 3 4 of rest, every few cycles stepping back to see what he had accomplished. His feelings were always ahead of his physical capacity to carve. If only he could work the four sides of the block at once. When he was releasing a rounded kneecap, the hairy leg and hoof of the satyr, the tiger's skin, he strove to pull out as much wholeness as possible in one go. Each day had to be fruitful. He had to find a handful of form for each session of carving before he could put aside his hammer and chisel. Upon awakening he was heavily charged with nervous energy and his hours were one long drive. He could not leave one finger of a hand in a more advanced state than the others, for he worked in units. Each day's work was a full unit. It was these small bundles of intense entities throughout his sculpture that characterized his potency as a sculptor. Just before retiring he looked over his work, spotted what had to be done the next day. During the evening, when he wrote to his family, he proudly signed the letters, Michelangelo, Sculptor in Rome. Because he would take no time off for friends or rest or social life, Balducci accused him of trying to escape the world by fleeing into marble. He admitted to his friend that he was half right. The sculptor carries into the marble the vision of a more luminous world than the one that surrounds him. But the artist was not in flight, he was in pursuit. He was trying with all his might to overtake a vision. Did God really rest on the seventh day? In the cool of that long afternoon, when he was refreshed, might he not have asked himself, whom have I on earth to speak for me? I had best create another species, one apart. I will call him artist. His will be the task to bring meaning and beauty to the world. Nevertheless Balducci arrived faithfully every Sunday afternoon in the hope of seducing him out of the shed. He found for Michelangelo a girl so like Clarissa that Michelangelo was tempted. But the marble was exhausting. Between the two there could be no choice. When I have completed the Bacchus, I'll go out with you, he promised Balducci. Balducci shook his head in despair. Just think of putting off the good things of life for so long. It's throwing time into the Tiber. Keyed up with his own fulfillment, Michelangelo threw back his head and laughed heartily with his friend. His deepest emotional reaction came when breaking through a supporting web, noting the translucent quality of the marble where the breakthrough was to take place, where that space would shortly be pouring through, the space that gave the limbs their freedom of movement, their independence, that permitted his forms to breathe air the moment his point felt no resistance. His most delicate task was carving away the marble between the arm that held the lovely, ornamented wine cup and the side of the tilted head. He worked with infinite gentleness until he reached the sloping shoulder line. He did not yet feel secure enough to hammer away the web supporting the upheld arm and outstretched knee. Balducci ragged him mercilessly. "This is sheer prejudice. How come you didn't keep a column to hold up the poor fellow's privates? Suppose they fell off. That would be worse than his dropping that bowl you're so frightened of losing." Michelangelo reached for a handful of marble dust and threw it at him. "Have you never had a thought that didn't originate in the erogenous zone? Does anyone?" He finally acceded to Balducci's importuning that he watch some of the Roman spectacles, and went with him to Mount Testaccio to see Rome celebrate Carnival before Lent. They stood on a hillside while 4 young pigs, combed and tied with ribbons by special barbers, were bound in turbo-flagged carts. At a signal from the trumpeters the carts were rolled down the hill toward the Aventine, with the populace rushing after them, armed with knives, yelling, "Al porco! Al porco!" At the bottom of the hill the carts smashed, the people fell upon the animals, fighting each other to see who could slice off the best pieces of meat. When Michelangelo returned to the house he found the French Cardinal Groslay of Saint-Denis there. Galli broke a self-imposed rule by asking if they might take the Cardinal out to the workshop to see the Bacchus. Michelangelo could not refuse. In the lamplighted shed Michelangelo explained that he was working all around the figure simultaneously, to keep the forms advancing in the same stage of development. He showed how, in order to open the space between the 2 legs, and between the left arm and torso, he worked the front and then the back of the block, continuously making the marble web thinner and thinner. As the Cardinal of Saint-Denis watched, he picked up a point and demonstrated the extremely light tapping required for the breakthrough, then used an agnuto to remove the rest of the web, freeing the limbs. But how do you achieve in a half-finished figure this sense of throbbing vitality? I can feel the blood and muscle under your marble skin. It is good to see new marble masters arising. A few days later a servant brought a note to the work shed from Galli. "Won't you join Groslay and myself for supper tonight?" Michelangelo quit work at sundown, went to the baths close by, steamed the marble dust out of his pores, put on a fresh shirt and hose, brushed his hair forward over his brow. Signor Galli served a light supper, for the Cardinal still followed the disciplines of his early years, ate no meat, and touched all food sparingly. His fading eyes gleamed in the candlelight as he turned to Michelangelo. "You know, my son, I am growing old. I must leave something behind me, something of singular beauty to add to the beauties of Rome. A tribute from France, from Charles VIII and my humble self. I have secured permission from the Pope to dedicate a sculpture in the chapel of the Kings of France in St. Peter's. There is a niche that will take a life-size sculpture." Michelangelo had not touched any of Galli's excellent Trebbiano wine, but he felt as though he had drunk more than Count Gonazzo on a warm afternoon. A sculpture for St. Peter's, the oldest and most sacred basilica in Christendom, built over the tomb of St. Peter. Could it be possible that the French cardinal would choose him? But from what? The little Cupid? The still nascent Bacchus in his work shed? By the time he brought his senses back to the table, the conversation had changed. The Cardinal was telling Jacopo Galli of the writings of two unorthodox post-Nicene fathers. Then the Cardinal's carriage came for him. He bade Michelangelo a pleasant good night. That Sunday Michelangelo went to Mass in St. Peter's to see the chapel of the kings of France and the niche about which the Cardinal of San Dionigi had talked. He climbed the 35 stairs of marble and porphyry leading up to the basilica, crossed the atrium, passed the center fountain surrounded by porphyry columns and stood at the base of the Carlovin and bell tower, aghast at the dilapidated condition of St. Peter's, which was leaning sharply to the left. Inside he found the chapel of the kings of France to be of modest size, dark, the main light coming from small windows up near the roof, the only ornamentation some sarcophagi borrowed from pagan and early Christian tombs, and a wooden crucifix and a niche on the side. He measured with his eye the vacant niche on the opposite wall, disappointed to find it so deep that a statue would be seen only from the front. It was 7 days before Galli brought up the subject again. You know, Michelangelo, this commission of the Cardinal of San Dionigi's could be the most important since Paolo was assigned to do a tomb for Sixtus IV. Michelangelo's heart began to pound. What are my chances? Galli counted on his long supple fingers as on an abacus that reckoned artistic probability. First, I must convince the Cardinal that you are the best sculptor in Rome. Second, you must conceive a theme that will inspire him. Third, we must secure a signed contract. It would have to be a spiritual theme. Not because Grosley is a member of the church, but because he is a deeply spiritual man. He has lived in Rome for 3 years in such a state of grace that he literally has not seen and does not know that Rome is rotten at its core. Is it innocence? Or blindness? Could we say that it is faith? If a man is as pure in heart as the Cardinal of San Dionigi, he walks with God's hand on his shoulder, he sees beyond present evil to the church eternal. Can I create a marble that would have the hand of God on it? Galli shook his leonine head. That is a problem you must wrestle with yourself. To carve decay all day, and the same time conceive a devout theme, seemed an impossible undertaking. Yet he knew very soon that his theme would be a Pietà, pity, sorrow. He had wanted to do a Pietà ever since he had completed his Madonna and Child, for just as the Madonna and Child was the beginning, the Pietà was the end, the preordained conclusion of everything that Mary had decided in that fateful hour God had allotted to her. Now, 33 years later, her son was again on her lap, having completed his journey. Galli was intrigued with his thinking, took him to the Cardinal of San Dionigi's palace, where they waited for the Cardinal to complete the 5 daily hours of prayer and offices required of every Benedictine. The 3 men sat in the open loggia, facing the Via Recta, with a painted Annunciation behind them. The Cardinal was ashen after his long devotions. Michelangelo's practiced eye could perceive almost no body lines beneath his robe. But when the Cardinal heard about the Pietà his eyes sparkled. What about the marble, Michelangelo? Could you find such a perfect piece as you speak of, here in Rome? I think not, Your Grace. A column, yes, but an oblong block that is wider than it is tall, and cut deep, that I have not seen. Then we must turn to Carrara. I shall write to the brothers in Lucca, asking for aid. If they cannot find what we need, you must go yourself to the quarries and find our marble. Michelangelo bounded out of his chair. Did you know, Father, that the higher one quarries the purer white the marble becomes? No earth stains, no pressure to make holes or hollows. If we could quarry at the peak of Monte Sagro, there we would find the supreme block. On the way home Galli said, you must go to Carrara at once. I will advance the expenses for your trip, "I can't." "Why not?" "I must finish the Bacchus," he replied. "The Bacchus can wait. The Cardinal can't. One day soon God will rest his hand just a trifle more heavily on his shoulder, and Grosley will go to heaven. From heaven she cannot commission a Pieta." "That is true. But I cannot stop work now," Michelangelo insisted stubbornly. "I release you from our agreement. When you have finished the Pieta you will come back to the Bacchus. For me there is no coming back. The sculpture is growing complete in my mind. I must finish it now to get it perfect. I'm always amazed to find a romantic in affairs of practical business." Galli sighed. "I shan't burden the Cardinal with the details of your orthodoxy. Until the Bacchus is completed the Pieta cannot begin. I behave virtuously because I must." He removed the short column between the base and the heel of the Bacchus, and the right foot, which was half suspended in the air, poised on its toes. Then he raised his drill to release the web between the elbow and the cup, drilling a series of holes close to the arm, delicately filing away the remaining marble. Finally he cut away the right-hand corner round of the cup, to free the hand and cup now extending high into space. The satyr in the lower left-hand corner and the cup at the upper right completed each other. His whole figure in the round was balanced superbly. He walked about it, satisfaction in his face and shoulders as his eye reviewed the line from the thrust of the right knee to the tip of the opposite shoulder, the tension from the edge of the ball through the crotch to the corner of the satyr's hoof. The emphasis of his figure was in its weight masses. In the head projecting forward, the hard torso projecting outward, then flowing into the stomach, which pulled the whole body downward toward the loins. In the rear the two heavy buttocks served as a steadying weight, the balance held by the beautiful legs, though not too securely because the body was reeling, the left foot planted solidly, the right on tiptoe increased the sense of vertigo. "You're like an engineer," said Galli when he saw it, his expression rapt as he traced Michelangelo's design. "That's what I told Bertoldo a sculptor had to be. In the days of the emperors you would have been designing colosseums, baths and reservoirs. Instead, you've created a soul." Michelangelo's eyes glowed yellow at the compliment. "No soul, no sculpture. Many of my ancient pieces were found broken in several places, yet when we put them together their spirit persisted. That was the sculptor still alive in the marble." The following Sunday he went to dine with the Russellai, eager to hear news of Florence. Savonarola was at the heart of most of the happenings. The Florentine colony had been delighted with him for defying the Pope, for advising the Borgia that unjust excommunications were invalid, and for celebrating 3 forbidden masses in San Marco at Christmas. Savonarola had then written to kings, statesmen and churchmen all over Europe urging that a council be called to purge the Borgia, and to institute sweeping reforms that would rid the Church of simony, the purchase not only of cardinalates but of the papacy itself. On February 11, 1498, he had again preached in the Duomo against the Pope, and 2 weeks later had walked outside the cathedral with the host in his hand, before thousands of Florentines packed into the piazza, and beseeched God to strike him dead if he deserved excommunication. When God refrained, Savonarola celebrated his vindication by ordering another burning of the vanities. Florence was once again looted by the army of boys. Savonarola's letters calling for a reformation were circulated secretly by the Florentines in Rome, to whom he had become an idol. When Michelangelo described to them the burning of the vanities that he had witnessed, the hundreds of irreplaceable manuscripts, books, paintings, sculptures that had been destroyed, they were not distressed. "Any price is cheap in a famine," cried Cavalcanti. "We must destroy the Borgia at any cost." Michelangelo was thoughtful. "What will you think of this price in a few years when the Pope and Botticelli are both dead? There will be another Pope, but there can never be another Botticelli. All the works he threw on that fire are gone forever. It seems to me you are approving lawlessness in Florence to rid yourselves of lawlessness here in Rome. If he could not touch them with his reasoning, the Pope touched them where it hurt. He promised to confiscate all business properties of the Florentines and to turn them out of the city penniless unless the Signoria of Florence sent Savonarola to Rome to stand trial. From what Michelangelo could gather, the colony made a complete capitulation. Savonarola had to be silenced, he had to honor his excommunication, to seek absolution from the Pope. They petitioned the Signoria to act in their behalf and to send Savonarola under guard to Rome. All the Pope asked, they explained, was that Savonarola come to Rome and receive absolution. Then he could return to Florence to save souls. Before the end of March, a rumor spread through Rome that sent Michelangelo racing to the pond. Savonarola's second-in-command, Francis Domenico, had committed himself to an ordeal by fire. The colony assembled at the home of the Patriarch, Cavalcanti. When Michelangelo entered the house he was plunged into a hubbub that tumbled down the stairs from the drawing room. "What does it mean, ordeal by fire?" he asked. "Is it what Savonarola tried before Carnival, asking to be struck dead if his words were not inspired by God?" "Similar. Except that fire burns." This last development had been originated either by Francis Domenico himself or by the Dominicans' enemy in the struggle for power, the Franciscans, led by Francesco di Puglia. In a fiery sermon in defense of their leader, Francis Domenico had declared that he would enter fire to prove that everything Savonarola taught was inspired by God, and he challenged a Franciscan to enter with him. The next day Francesco di Puglia accepted the challenge, but insisted that Savonarola himself must enter the fire, saying that only if Savonarola came through the fire alive could Florence believe him to be a true prophet. Meeting for supper at the Pitti Palace, a young group of rabbiati assured Francesco and the Franciscans that Savonarola would never accept, that by his refusal he would prove to Florence that he had no true faith in God's saving him. At this point the voters of Florence turned against Savonarola politically. They had already endured 7 years of wrangling, the Pope's threat to put an interdict on the entire population, which amounted to an excommunication that could paralyze trade and cause bitter turmoil. The city needed a 3% tax on church property which the Pope now agreed to allow, once Savonarola was quieted. They defeated the Signoria pledged to Savonarola and elected a new council which was against him. Florence was threatened with another Guelph and Ghibelline-like civil war. On April 7 the platform was erected in the Piazza della Signoria, the logs smeared with pitch. A vast crowd assembled to watch the show. The Franciscans refused to enter the piazza until Francis Domenico agreed not to take the host into the fire. After a number of hours of waiting, a fierce winter rainstorm drenched the platform, scattering the crowd and putting an end to any burning. The following night the rabbiati mobbed the monastery of San Marco, killing a number of Savonarola's followers. The Signoria moved in, arrested Savonarola, Francis Domenico and Francis Silvestro, the third-in-command, and jailed them in the bell tower of the Palazzo della Signoria. The Pope sent a courier to Florence demanding that Savonarola be delivered to him in Rome. The Signoria refused, but appointed a commission of 17 to examine Savonarola and secure a confession that his words were not divinely inspired. Savonarola refused to recant. The commission tortured him, first using the rack and the screw, then roping him to a pulley, raising him in the air, dropping him with a sudden jerk of the dot. Savonarola became delirious, agreed to write a confession. He was released to his cell. What he wrote was not satisfactory to the Signoria. He was tortured again. Weak from fasting and all-night prayers, Savonarola again succumbed, signed a confession written by a notary, but not before he rejected the paper and had to be tortured a third time. The commission declared Savonarola guilty of heresy. The Special Advisory Council called by the Signoria sentenced him to death. At the same time, the Pope granted the city its long-desired 3% tax on all church property in Tuscany. 3 platforms were built from the steps of the Palazzo della Signoria into the square. The throng began filling the piazza during the night, pushing up against the gibbet. By dawn the square and all the streets leading into it were receiving mass. Savonarola, Francis Domenico and Francis Silvestro were led out onto the Signoria steps, stripped of their vestments, their tonsures scraped. They mounted the scaffold, praying silently. They climbed a steep ladder to the top of the gibbet. Ropes and chains were put about their necks. Within an instant, all 3 were dangling, their necks broken. The pyre under the gibbet was lighted. The flames rose. The 3 bodies were held aloft by the chains after the ropes had burned. The Rabbiati stoned the half-consumed corpses. The ashes were collected, carried in carts to the old bridge, and dumped into the Arno. The martyrdom of Savonarola shook Michelangelo profoundly. He had sat as a boy and listened to Pico della Mirandola recommend to Lorenzo that the friar be invited to Florence. Savonarola had contributed to the deaths of Lorenzo, Pico, Poliziano, and now he too was dead. He hardly knew what to think or feel, except pity. He turned to his work. Marble was dependable in a chaotic world. It had its own will and intelligence and stability. With marble in his hands, the world was good. He became impatient to be finished with the Bacchus. He had only indicated the position of the forehead, nose, mouth, wanting to let the rest of the figure suggest the expression of the face. Now he completed the features, the expression dazed as the Bacchus stared at the cup of wine, the eyes bulging, the mouth opened greedily. For the grapes he used the drill, making each one round and juice-laden. To achieve the hair on the satyr's goat legs he sliced the rough-edged marble with a fully rounded chisel which brought out the rhythmic play of curls, each tuft designed separately. There was left 2 months of polishing to get the glowing flesh effects he wanted. Though this work involved infinite and precision, it was technical in nature and used only that part of him which was the craftsman. It left his mind free during the warm spring hours to reflect on the Pieta and its meaning. In the cool of the evenings, he began searching for this last moment that mother and son would spend together. He asked Jacopo Galli if he could now complete a contract with the Cardinal of San Dionigi. Galli explained that the Cardinal's monastery in Lucca had already ordered a block to Michelangelo's dimensions. The block had been cut, but the quarry at Carrara had refused to ship it to Rome before being paid. The monastery at Lucca had in turn refused to pay until the Cardinal approved the block. The quarry had grown tired of holding it and had sold it to a buying agent. That night Michelangelo wrote an agreement which he thought would be fair to himself and to the Cardinal of San Dionigi. Galli read it without expression, said he would take it to his bank and put it in a safe place. By the end of summer the Bacchus was finished. Galli was overjoyed with his statue. "I feel as though Bacchus is fully alive, and will drop his cup at any moment. The satyr is innocent and naughty at the same time. You have made for me the finest sculpture in all Italy. We must place it in the garden and give it a party." The blind Augustinians, Aurelius and Raphael Lippus, studied the Bacchus with their sensitive fingers, running them over every detail and saying they had never seen a male figure so powerful in projecting its inner life force. Professor Pomponius Letus, who had been tortured by the Inquisition for paganism, was moved to tears, avowing that the statue was pure Greek in its structure and its gleaming white satiny finish. Serafino, the poet from Luca Sborgia's court, hated it on sight, declaring it ugly, wanton, without any sense of loveliness. Sannazaro, the poet who mixed Christian and pagan images in his verses, declared it a complete synthesis, Greek in carving, Christian in emotion, combining the best of both, even as the Plato 4 had commented on his Madonna and Child. Peter Sabonis, professor of eloquence at the university, collector of Christian inscriptions, and his friend Giovanni Capocci, who was excavating the catacombs, came back 3 times to debate the statue's virtues between themselves, finally concluding that, although they did not for antique themes, this Bacchus was something new in the art of sculpture. It was Giuliano da Sangallo's opinion Michelangelo valued most. Sangallo gleefully traced the intricate structural design. "You've built this Bacchus the way we build a temple or palace." It was a dangerous, and courageous, experiment in construction. You could easily have suffered a collapse of material. This fellow will stand erect as long as there is space for him to displace. The following night Galli brought home a contract he himself had written between Michelangelo and the Cardinal of San Dionigi, and which the Cardinal had signed. In it Michelangelo found himself called Maestro for the first time, but he was also described as statuario, statue maker, which was deflating. For the sum of 450 ducats in papal gold he agreed to make a Pieta of marble, 150 ducats to be paid as he began, and 100 ducats every 4th month. By the end of a year the statue was to be completed. In addition to guaranteeing the Cardinal's payments to Michelangelo, Galli had written, "I, Jacopo Galli, do promise that the work will be more beautiful than any work in marble to be seen in Rome today, and such that no master of our own time will be able to produce a better." Michelangelo gazed at Galli with affection. "You must have written this contract at home, rather than the bank." "Why?" "Because you have taken quite a gamble. Suppose when I finish the Cardinal says, 'I have seen better marbles in Rome.' What happens then?" "I give his grace back his papal ducats." "And you are stuck with the carving." Galli's eyes twinkled. "I could endure it." He went searching the stone yards of Trastevere and the ports for the kind of block he needed, but a 7-foot wide, 6-foot tall, 3-foot deep cut of marble was rarely quarried on the chance of sale. It took him only 2 days to complete the rounds. There was nothing even faintly resembling the massive block he needed. The next day, when he had decided that he would have to go to Carrara at his own expense, Guffatti came running up the Riario to his workshed, crying out, "Just unloaded a barge. The very size you're looking for. It was cut for some order in Lucca. The quarry never got paid, so they sold it." He dog-trotted down to the Ripetta dock. There it stood, gleaming pure and white in the summer sun, beautifully cut by the quarrymen high in the mountains of Carrara. It tested out perfect against the hammer, against water, its crystals soft and compacted with fine graining. He came back before dawn the next morning, watched the rays of the rising sun strike the block and make it as transparent as pink alabaster, with not a hole or hollow or crack or knot to be seen in all its massive white weight. His Pieta block had come home. He removed the last reminders of the Bacchus, settled down to the Pieta. But the Bacchus had become a controversial figure. Many people came to see it. Galli brought the visitors to the workshop or sent the servant to the shed to ask if Michelangelo would mind coming to the garden. He found himself plunged into explanations and defenses, particularly from the Bregno enthusiasts, who attacked it as a perversion of the Dionysus legend. When there were admirers he found himself involved in describing his concept and technique. Galli wanted him for supper every night now, and Sundays, so that he could make as many friends as possible, opened the way to more commissions. The Russellai, Cavalcanti, Altaviti were proud of him. They gave parties in his honor, from which he awoke the next morning feeling tired. He yearned to put the Bacchus behind him, to wipe the slate of his mind clean of the pagan carving and make the transition to the spirituality he needed to think about the Pieta. After a month of festivities it became clear that he was not going to be able to conceive or carve a Pieta under these diverting conditions, that with his emergence as a professional sculptor had come the time to establish his own quarters and workshop where he could live quietly, secluded, work night and day if he wished, dedicate himself to abstemiousness. He had grown up, he was on his own. He could see no other way. Perceptive Jacopo Galli asked, "Something is troubling you, Michelangelo?" "Yes." "It sounds serious." "Just ungrateful. You owe me nothing." The men to whom I owe the most have all said that, Lorenzo de' Medici, Bertoldo, Aldobrandi, and now you. Tell me what you want to do. "To move out," he blurted. "Life with the Galli family is too pleasant." He paused. "I feel the need to work in my own household. As a man, rather than a boy, and perennial guest. Does this sound foolish?" Galli gazed at him wistfully. "I want only that you be happy, and that you carve the most beautiful marbles in Italy. For me they are one and the same." He was directed to several houses in which the ground floor was available, one recommended by Altaviti in the Florentine quarter, another near the Piazza del Quirinal, with a fine view of Rome. They were too elaborate and expensive. On the third day, on the Via Sistina, across from the Bear Inn and on the edge of the Campo Marzio lying below the embankment of the Tiber, he found a big corner room with two windows, one facing north for steady light, the other east for the sharp sunlight he sometimes needed. At the rear was a smaller room with a fireplace. He paid a few scudi for 2 months' rent, drew up the oiled linen on wooden frames that served as window covering, and studied the shabby space, the wooden floor, thin in spots, broken in others, cement crumbling between the stones of the walls, the ceiling plaster falling in patches, exposing variegated colors of decay where the rain had leaked through. He put the key in his pocket and returned to the Gallis. He found Buonarrotti waiting for him. His brother was jubilant. He had come as a guard on a mule train, and so the trip had cost him nothing. He was going back the same way. Michelangelo gazed with pleasure at the stubby features, the hair combed over Buonarroti's brow in imitation of his own. It had been a year since they had seen each other. "You couldn't have come at a better time," he cried. "I need help in setting up my new home." "You have taken a place? Good, then I can stay with you." "Wait till you see my palatial quarters before you settle in," said Michelangelo, smiling. "Come with me to Trastevere. I need a supply of plaster, whitewash and light. But first I will show you my Bacchus." Buonarrotti stood gazing at the statue a long time. Then he asked, "Did people like it?" "Most did." "I'm glad." That was all. Michelangelo observed to himself, he doesn't have the faintest notion of what sculpture is about. His only interest is that people approve what I've done, so that I can be happy, and get more work. None of which he will ever understand. He's a true Buonarrotti, blind to the meaning of art. But he loves me. They bought the supplies, had dinner at the Trattoria Toscana, then Michelangelo took his brother to the Via Sistina. When Buonarrotti entered the room he whistled sharply. "Michelangelo, surely you're not thinking of living in this hole? The place is falling apart." "You and I are going to put it back together," replied Michelangelo grimly. "It is adequate workspace. Father would be distressed." Michelangelo smiled. "Don't tell him." He set a tall ladder in the center of the room. "Let's scrap this ceiling." When they had scrapped and given the ceiling a coat of plaster, they began on the walls, then set to work patching the broken floor with odd-sized pieces of wood. Next they turned their attention to the private courtyard. The only door to it was from the side of his room, but the other tenants had access from their windows, as a result of which it was covered with a thick compost of garbage and debris. The odor was as thick as the enclosing walls. It took 2 days to shovel the refuse into sacks and carry it through his own room to a vacant lot below the Tiber. Balducci, who held all physical labor in abhorrence, showed up after Michelangelo and Buonarroti had finished their repairs. He knew a second-hand furniture dealer in Trastevere, where he bargained shrilly for the best prices on a bed, mattress, kitchen table, 2 cane chairs, chest of drawers, a few pots, dishes and knives. When the donkey cart arrived a few hours later, the brothers set up the bed under the window to the east, where Michelangelo would be waked at first light. The chest of drawers went on the back wall, next to the opening to the kitchen. Under the front north window he placed a table of 4 planks on horses, for his drawing, wax and clay modeling. The center of the big room he kept clear for his marble. In the rear cubicle they installed the kitchen table, 2 chairs, pots and dishes. Balducci returned, having explored the neighborhood. "There's a plump little partridge lives just behind your rooms, blonde, about 15, beautifully made, French, I think. I could persuade her to become your servant. Think how pleasant it would be to finish work at noon and find her in your kitchen over a pot of hot soup." Balducci did a little dance. "And at night, to find her in your bed. It's part of their job, and you're going to need a little natural warmth in this cave." Michelangelo and Buonarroti chuckled at Balducci's ebullience. In another minute he would be out the front door and down the street after the girl. "Look, Balducci," cried Michelangelo. "I want no entanglements, and have no money for a servant. If I need anyone, I'll stick to the artist's custom of taking in a young apprentice and training him in return for services." Buonarroti agreed. "I'll keep my eyes open in Florence for a bright young lad." Buonarroti settled Michelangelo in, shopped and cooked the food, cleaned the rooms. The housekeeping went downhill the moment he left. Immersed in his work, Michelangelo took no time off to cook, to go out to a restaurant or eat in the streets. He lost weight, even as his rooms lost their tidy appearance. He saw nothing about him but his workbench and the huge white block sitting on beams in the center of the floor. He never bothered to make his bed or to wash the dishes he left on the kitchen table. The rooms became covered with dust from the street, ashes from the kitchen fire where he boiled water for an occasional hot drink. He knew by the end of a month that this system was not going to work. He even began to eye Balducci's little French girl, who passed his door more frequently than he thought strictly necessary. Buonarroti solved his problem. Michelangelo answered to a knock late one afternoon to see standing in the street a plain-faced, olive-complexioned lad of about 13, travel-stained, holding out a letter on which Michelangelo recognized his brother's handwriting. The note introduced Piero Argento, who had come to Florence looking for a sculptor to whom he could be apprenticed. He had been sent by someone to the Buonarroti house, then made the long trip on foot to Rome. Michelangelo invited him in, studied the boy while he told of his family and their farm near Ferrara. His manner was quiet, his voice plain. "Can you read and write, Argento? The Gesuati fathers in Ferrara taught me to write. Now I need to learn a trade. And you think sculpture might be a good one? I want a 3-year apprenticeship. With a guild contract." Michelangelo was impressed by the forthrightness. He gazed into the muddy brown eyes of the stringy lad before him, at the soiled shirt, worn-out sandals, the thin, hungry cheeks. You have no friends in Rome? No place to go? I came to see you. Stubbornly. I live simply, Argento. You can expect no luxury. I am of contadini. What is to eat, we eat. Since you need a home, and I need a helper, suppose we try it for a few days. If it doesn't work out, we part as friends. I'll pay your way back to Florence. Agreed. Gracie. Take this coin, and go to the baths near Santa Maria dell'Anima. On the way back, stop at the market for food to cook. I make a good soup of the country. My mother taught me before she died. The fathers had taught Argento not only to count but also to be doggedly honest. He left the house before dawn for the markets, carrying with him a scrap of crayon and paper. Michelangelo was touched by the way he painfully kept his accounts written down, so many denarii for vegetables, so many for meat, for fruit, for bread and pasta, with every coin accounted for. Michelangelo put a modest amount in a cooking pot as their weekly allowance. Argento was a relentless pursuer of bargains. Within a week he knew every stall selling produce. His shopping took him the better part of the morning, which suited Michelangelo because it gave him the solitariness he sought. They established a simple routine. After their one-dish midday dinner, Argento cleaned the rooms while Michelangelo took an hour's walk along the Tiber to the docks to listen to the Sicilians hissing as they unloaded the boats. By the time he returned home, Argento was taking his riposo on the truckle bed in the kitchen under the wooden sink. Michelangelo had 2 more hours of quiet at his workbench before Argento woke, washed his face noisily in a basin, and came to the work table for his daily instruction. These few hours in the afternoon appeared to be all the teaching Argento wanted. At dusk he was back in the kitchen, boiling water. By the time dark settled and he was asleep on his truckle bed, a blanket drawn securely over his head. Michelangelo then lit his oil lamps and returned to his workbench. He was grateful to Buonarrotti for sending Argento to him. The arrangement looked as though it would be satisfactory, despite the fact that Argento showed not a shred of talent for drawing. Later, when he began working the marble, he would teach the boy how to use a hammer and chisel. In the Bible he read from John 19:38-40. After this Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, asked Pilate to let him take away the body of Jesus. So he came and took Jesus' body away, and with him was Nicodemus. He brought with him a mixture of myrrh and aloes, of about 100 pounds weight. They took Jesus' body, then, and wrapped it in winding clothes with the spices. That is how the Jews prepare a body for burial. Listed as present at the descent were Mary, Mary's sister, Mary Magdalene, John, Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus. Search as he might, he could find no place where the Bible spoke of a moment when Mary could have been alone with Jesus. Mostly the scene was crowded with mourners, such as the dramatic Delric lamentation in Bologna, where the grief-stricken spectators had usurped Mary's last poignant moment. In his concept there could be no one else present. His first desire was to create mother and son alone in the universe. When might Mary have had that moment to hold her child on her lap? Perhaps after the soldiers had laid him on the ground, while Joseph of Arimathea was at Pontius Pilate's asking for Christ's body, Nicodemus was gathering his mixture of myrrh and aloes, and the others had gone home to mourn. Those who saw his finished Pieta would take the place of the biblical witnesses. They would feel what Mary was undergoing. There would be no halos, no angels. These would be 2 human beings, whom God had chosen. He felt close to Mary, having spent so long concentrating on the beginning of her journey. Now she was intensely alive, anguished. Her son was dead. Even though he would later be resurrected, he was at this moment dead indeed, the expression on his face reflecting what he had gone through on the cross. In his sculpture therefore it would not be possible for him to project anything of what Jesus felt for his mother, only what Mary felt for her son. Jesus's inert body would be passive, his eyes closed. Mary would have to carry the human communication. This seemed right to him. It was a relief to shift in his mind to technical problems. Since his Christ was to be life-size, how was Mary to hold him on her lap without the relationship seeming ungainly? His Mary would be slender of limb and delicate of proportion, yet she must hold this full-grown man as securely and convincingly as she would a child. There was only one way to accomplish this, by design, by drawing diagrams and sketches in which he probed the remotest corner of his mind for creative ideas to carry his concept. He started by making free sketches to loosen up his thinking so that images would appear on paper. Visually, these approximated what he was feeling within himself. At the same time he started walking the streets, peering at the people passing or shopping at the stalls, storing up fresh impressions of what they looked like, how they moved. In particular he sought the gentle, sweet-faced nuns, with head coverings and veils coming to the middle of their foreheads, remembering their expressions until he reached home and set them down on paper. Discovering that draperies could be designed to serve structural purposes, he began a study of the anatomy of folds. He improvised as he went along, completing a life-size clay figure, then bought yards of an inexpensive material from a draper, wet the lightweight cloth in a basin and covered it over with clay that Argento brought from the bank of the Tiber, to the consistency of thick mud. No fold could be accidental, each turn of the drapery had to serve organically, to cover the Madonna's slender legs and feet so that they would give substantive support to Christ's body, to intensify her inner turmoil. When the cloth dried and stiffened, he saw what adjustments had to be made. So that sculpture, commented Argento wryly, when he had sluiced down this floor for a week, making mud pies. Michelangelo grinned. See, Argento, if you control the way these folds are bunched, like this, or made to flow, you can enrich the body attitudes. They can have as much tactile appeal as flesh and bone. He went into the Jewish quarter, wanting to draw Hebraic faces so that he could reach a visual understanding of how Christ might have looked. The Jewish section was in Trastevere, near the Tiber at the church of San Francesco Ripa. The colony had been small until the Spanish Inquisition of 1492 drove many Jews into Rome. Here, for the most part, they were well treated, as a reminder of the Old Testament heritage of Christianity. Many of their gifted members were prominent in the Vatican as physicians, musicians, bankers. The men did not object to his sketching them while they went about their work, but no one could be persuaded to come to his studio to pose. He was told to ask for Rabbi Melzi at the synagogue on Saturday afternoon. Michelangelo found the rabbi in the room of study, a gentle old man with a white beard and luminous gray eyes, robed in black gabardine with a skullcap on his head. He was reading from the Talmud with a group of men from his congregation. When Michelangelo explained why he had come, Rabbi Melzi replied gravely, "The Bible forbids us to bow down to or to make graven images. That is why our creative people give their time to literature, not to painting or sculpture." "But, Rabbi Melzi, you don't object to others creating works of art?" "Not at all. Each religion has its own tenets. I am carving a Pieta from white Carrara marble. I wish to make Jesus an authentic Jew. I cannot accomplish this if you will not help me." The rabbi said thoughtfully, "I would not want my people to get in trouble with the church. I am working for the Cardinal of San Dionigi. I'm sure he would approve. What kind of models would you prefer?" "Workmen. In their mid-30s. Not bulky laborers, but sinewy men. With intelligence and sensitivity." Rabbi Melzi smiled at him with infinitely old but merry eyes. leave me your address. I will send you the best the quarter has to offer." Michelangelo hurried to St. Gallo's solitary bachelor room with his sketches, asked the architect to design a stand which would simulate the seated Madonna. St. Gallo studied the drawings and improvised a trestle couch. Michelangelo bought some scrap lumber. Together he and Argento built the stand, covering it with blankets. His first model arrived at dusk. He hesitated for a moment when Michelangelo asked him to disrobe, so Michelangelo gave him a piece of toweling to wrap around his loins, led him to the kitchen to take off his clothes. He then draped him over the rough stand, explained that he was supposed to be recently dead, and was being held on his mother's lap. The model quite plainly thought Michelangelo crazy, only the instructions from his rabbi kept him from bolting. But at the end of the sitting, when Michelangelo showed him the quick, free drawings, with the mother roughed in, holding her son, the model grasped what Michelangelo was after, and promised to speak to his friends. He worked for 2 hours a day with each model sent by the rabbi. Mary presented quite a different problem. Though the sculpture must take place 33 years after her moment of decision, he could not conceive of her as a woman in her mid-50s, old, wrinkled, broken in body and face by labor or worry. His image of the Virgin had always been that of a young woman, even as had his memory of his mother. Jacopo Galli introduced him into several Roman homes. Here he sketched, sitting in their flowing gowns of linen and silk, young girls not yet 20, some about to be married, some married a year or two. Since the Santo Spirito Hospital had taken only men, he had had no experience in the study of female anatomy, but he had sketched the women of Tuscany in their fields and homes. He was able to discern the body lines of the Roman women under their robes. He spent concentrated weeks putting his two figures together, a Mary who would be young and sensitive, yet strong enough to hold her son on her lap, and a Jesus who, though lean, was strong even in death. A look he remembered well from his experience in the dead room of Santo Spirito. He drew toward the composite design from his meticulously accurate memory, without need to consult his sketches. Soon he was ready to go into a three-dimensional figure in clay. Here he would have free expression because the material could be moved to distort forms. When he wanted to emphasize, or get greater intensity, he added or subtracted clay. Next he turned to wax because there was a similarity of wax to marble in tactile quality and translucence. He respected each of these approach techniques, and kept them in character. His quill drawings had a scratchiness, suggesting skin texture. The clay he used plastically to suggest soft-moving flesh, as in an abdomen, in a reclining torso. The wax he smoothed over to give the body surface an elastic pull. Yet he never allowed these models to become fixed in his mind. They remain rough starting points. When carving he was charged with spontaneous energy. Too careful or detailed studies in clay and wax would have glued him down to a mere enlarging of his model. The true surge had to be inside the marble itself. Drawing and models were his thinking. Carving was action. The arrangement with Argento was working well, except that sometimes Michelangelo could not figure who was master and who apprentice. Argento had been trained so rigorously by the Jesuits that Michelangelo was unable to change his habits, up before dawn to scrub the floors, whether they were dirty or not, water boiling on the fire for washing laundry every day, the pots scoured with river sand after each meal. Argento, this is senseless, he complained, not liking to work on the wet floors, particularly in cold weather. You're too clean. Scrub the studio once a week. That's enough. No, said Argento stolidly. Every day. Before dawn. I was stout. And God help anyone who tries to unteach you. Grumbled Michelangelo, yet he knew that he had nothing to grumble about, for Argento made few demands on him. The boy was becoming acquainted with the contadini families that brought produce into Rome. On Sundays he would walk miles into the Campagna to visit with them, and in particular to see their horses. The one thing he missed from his farm and the Po Valley was the animals. Frequently he would take his leave of Michelangelo by announcing, "Today I go see the horses." It took a piece of bad luck to show Michelangelo that the boy was devoted to him. He was crouched over his anvil in the courtyard getting his chisels into trim, when a splinter of steel flew into his eye and embedded itself in his pupil. He stumbled into the house, eyes burning like fire. Argento made him lie down on the bed, brought a pan of hot water, dipped some clean white linen cloth and applied it to extract the splinter. Though the pain was considerable, Michelangelo was not too concerned. He assumed he could blink the splinter out. But it would not come. Argento never left his side, keeping the water boiled, applying hot compresses throughout the night. By the second day Michelangelo began to worry, and by the second night he was in a state of panic. He could see nothing out of the afflicted eye. At dawn Argento went to Jacopo Galli. Galli arrived with his family surgeon, Maestro Lippi. The surgeon carried a cage of live pigeons. He told Argento to take a bird out of the cage, cut a large vein under its wing, let the blood gush into Michelangelo's injured eye. The surgeon came back at dusk, cut the vein of a second pigeon, again washed out the eye. All the next day Michelangelo could feel the splinter moving, pushing. By nightfall it was out. Argento had not slept for some 70 hours. "You're tired," said Michelangelo. "Why don't you take a few days off?" Argento's stubborn features lit up with pleasure. "I go visit the horses." At first Michelangelo had been bothered by the people going in and out of the Baroque Hotel across the street, the noise of their horses and carts on the cobbles, the cries of the grooms and babble of a dozen dialects. By now he had grown to enjoy the interesting characters who came from all over Europe for their pilgrimage, some wearing long gowns, others short tunics of brilliant greens and purples, others stiff hats. They served as an unending source of models for him to sketch at his work table as he saw them through the open window. Soon he came to know the clients. As a guest reappeared he quickly pulled out his drawing, made corrections or additions, caught the bodies in a variety of movements, unloading carriages, carrying valises, unshouldering packs, getting on and off mules. The noise in the street, the voices, the welcomes, the departures gave him company without intruding upon his privacy. Living in isolation as he was, this sense of other people in the world was companionable. It was all he needed, for with marble in his hands he would never stand on the periphery looking in, he would stand at the focal core looking out. In his pen and ink sketches for the Pieta he had cross-hatched the negative spaces, those parts of the block that had to be thrown away, indicating the tool strokes that should be used. Now, with hammer and chisel in hand, he found this roughing out unpleasing, impatient for that first moment when a flicker of a buried image shone through, when the block became a source of life that communicated with him. Then, from the space outside the block, he entered into his composition. After he had completed the sculpture, life would vibrate outward from the figures. But at this beginning moment the action was in reverse. The point of entry must be a force that sucked in space, pulling inward his gaze and attention. He had envisaged so big a block because he wanted to sculpture with an abundance of marble. He did not want to have to compress any portion of his forms, as he had had to compact the satyr close to the Bacchus. He broke into his marble block at the left side of the Madonna's head, worked to the left of the block, the north light behind him. By getting Argento to help him turn the block on its beams he was able to have the shadows fall exactly where the cavities were to be carved, a play of light and shadow to show him where he must cast out stone, for the marble he took away was also sculpture, creating its own effects. Now he had to plunge in boldly to find his principal features. The weight of the material of the Madonna's head covering, forcing her head downward to the inner hand of Christ that crossed her heart, compelled attention to the body stretched across her lap. The tight band which ran between the Virgin's breasts was like a tight hand constricting and crushing a palpitating heart. The lines of the drapery led to the Madonna's hand, with which she held her Son, securely, under his arm, then to the human aspects of Christ's body, to his face, the eyes closed serenely in deep sleep, the nose straight but full, the skin clear and firm, the soft mustache and delicate curling chain whiskers, the mouth filled with anguish. Because the Madonna was gazing down on her Son, all who looked must turn to her face, to see the sadness, the compassion for all men's sons, asking with tender despair, "What could I have done to save him?" And from the depth of her love, what purpose has all this served, if man cannot be saved? All who saw would feel how insupportably heavy was her Son's dead body on her lap, how much heavier was the burden in her heart. It was unusual to combine two life-size figures in the same sculpture, revolutionary to put a full-grown man onto the lap of a woman. From this point of departure he left behind all conventional concepts of the Pieta. Once again, even as Ficino had believed that Plato could have been Christ's most loving disciple, it was Michelangelo's desire to blend the classical Greek concept of the beauty of the human body with the Christian ideal of the immortality of the human soul. He banished the lugubrious death throes of the earlier Pietas, bathed his two figures in tranquility. Human beauty could reveal sacredness as clearly as could pain. At the same time, it could exalt. All of this, and much more, the marble must be persuaded to say. If the end result were tragic, then doubly must they walk in beauty, beauty that his own love and dedication could match in this flawless white block. He would make mistakes, but the mistakes would be made with loving hands. Winter came down like a clap of thunder, cold, but raw. As Buonarroti had predicted, there were leaks. Michelangelo and Argento moved his workbench and bed to dry sections of the room, brought the forge in from the courtyard. He wore his baloney cap over his head and ears. His nostrils swelled, giving him constant pain, making breathing difficult. He bought a black iron brazier to put under his work stool, which warmed him posteriorly, but the moment he moved to another section of the room his blood froze. He had to send Argento out for 2 more braziers, and baskets of coal, which they could hardly afford. When his fingers were blue he tried to carve while wearing woolen mittens. Within the hour he had an accident. Some marble fell away and he felt his heart go down to his feet as the chunk hit the floor. One Sunday Argento returned from an outing feeling hot and strange. By midnight he had a high fever. Michelangelo picked him up off his truckle bed and put him into his own. By morning Argento was in a delirium, sweating profusely, crying out names of relatives, fragments of stories, of beatings, accidents. Michelangelo wiped him dry, and a number of times had to restrain him from jumping out of bed. At dawn, he summoned a passer-by and sent him for a doctor. The doctor stood in the doorway, cried, "It's the plague. Burn everything he has touched since he came in here," and fled. Michelangelo sent a message to Galli. Maestro Lippi took one look, said scoffingly, "Nonsense, it is not the plague. Quartan fever. Has he been around the Vatican lately? He walked there on Sunday. And probably drank some stagnant water in the ditch beneath the walls. Go to the French monks on the Esquiline, they make a glutinous pill of sagepan, salt, coloquint." Michelangelo begged a neighbor to sit with Argento. It took him almost an hour in the pelting rain to cross the city, Go down the long street from Trajan's Forum, past Augustus Forum and the Basilica of Constantine, the Colosseum, then up the Esquiline Hill to the monastery. The pills lessened Argento's headache, and Michelangelo thought he was making good progress during 2 quiet days. Then the delirium returned. At the end of the week Michelangelo was exhausted. He had brought Argento's bed into the big room, and was catching a few moments of sleep while Argento dozed, but worse than the lack of sleep was the problem of food, for he was unwilling to leave the boy alone. Balducci knocked on the door. "I told you to take that French girl at the rear. Then when she got sick, her family would have nursed her." "Let's not go backward," said Michelangelo wearily. "Forward is hard enough. You can't keep him here. You look like a skeleton. Take him to the Santo Spirito hospital." "And let him die?" "Why should he die any faster at a hospital?" "Because they don't get any dot." "What kind of are you giving him, Dr. Buonarrotti?" "I keep him clean, watch over him. He took of me when I hurt my eye. How can I abandon him to a ward? That's not Christian. If you insist on committing suicide, I'll bring you food each morning before I go to the bank." Michelangelo's eyes filled with gratitude. "Balducci, you just play at being cynical. Here's some money, buy me towels, and a sheet or two." Michelangelo turned to find Argento watching him. "I'm going to die." "No, you're not, Argento. Nothing kills a countryman but a falling cliff." The illness took 3 weeks to pass. What hurt most was the loss of almost a month of work. He began to worry that he could not finish his statue within the stipulated year's time. Winter was mercifully short in Rome. By March the Campagna was flooded with a bright, brittle sunlight. The stones of the workshop began to thaw. And with the warmer weather came the Cardinal of San Dionigi to see how his Pieta was faring. Each time Michelangelo saw him there appeared to be more material and less body in his robes. He asked Michelangelo if he had been receiving his payments regularly. Michelangelo assured him that he had. They stood in front of the massive white block in the middle of the room. The figures were still rough, with much webbing left for support, but he had done considerable carving on the 2 faces, and that was what interested the Cardinal most. "Tell me, my son," he said softly, "how does the Madonna's face remain so young, younger than her son's?" "Your Grace, it seemed to me that the Virgin Mary would not age. She was pure, and so she would have kept her freshness of youth." The answer was satisfactory to the Cardinal. "I hope you will finish in August. It is my dearest wish to hold services in St. Peter's for the installation." He carved in a fury from first light to dark, then threw himself across his bed, without supper and fully clothed, like a dead man. He awoke around midnight, refreshed, his mind seething with sculptural ideas. Craving to get at the marble, he got up, nibbled at a heel of bread, lit the brass lamp in which he burned the dregs of the olive oil, and tried to set it at an angle that would throw light on the area he was carving. The light was too diffused. It was not safe to use a chisel. He bought some heavy paper, made a hat with a peak, tied a wire around the outside and in the center fashioned a loop big enough to hold a candle. The light, as he held his face a few inches from the marble, was bright and steady. Nor did his pounding waken Argento under the kitchen sink, blanket over his head. The candles burned quickly, the soft wax running over the peak of his paper cap and onto his forehead, but he was delighted with his invention. Late one night there was a sharp rap at the door. He opened it to find Leo Bagliani, dressed in an indigo velvet cloak, surrounded by a group of his young friends who were holding horn lanterns or wax torches on long poles. "I saw the light and came to see what you were doing at this ungodly hour." "You're working." What's that stuff all over your eyebrows? Michelangelo proudly showed them his cap and candle. Leo and his friends burst into a paroxysm of laughter. Why don't you use goat's tallow? It's harder, you won't be eating it all night, exclaimed Leo, when he caught his breath. Argento disappeared the next day after supper, came back at the second hour of evening weighed down with 4 heavy bundles which he dumped on the bed. Signor Bagliani sent for me. These are a present. Michelangelo extracted a hard yellow taper. I don't need his assistance, he cried. Take them back. They have broken my arm from the Campo de Fiori. I won't carry them back. I'll set them in front of the door and burn them all at once. Very well, let me see if they are better than wax. But first I'll have to widen the spire loop. Leo had known what he was talking about. The goat's tallow melted more slowly and remained in the pool where it fell. He divided the night into 2 halves, one for sleep, the other for work, and made rapid progress carving the voluminous outer folds of Mary's robe, Christ's lower torso, his legs, the inner one raised so that it would be visible from the front, leaving a webbing connecting it with Mary's outstretched hand to protect it. He refused all invitations, saw few of his friends though Balducci kept bringing the news. Cardinal Giovanni, unwanted and unnoticed by the Borgia, had left to travel in Europe. Piero, trying to raise an army for a third attack on Florence, had been ostracized by the colony. Florence's intermittent war with Pisa had flared again. Torrigiani had joined Caesar Borgia's troops as an officer to help conquer the Romagna for the Vatican. The Borgia was excommunicating lords and churchmen, appropriating their lands. No Florentine knew when his turn would be next. It was on a glorious summer morning with the air so translucent that the Alban hills seemed only a piazza away, that Paolo Russelli sent for him to come as soon as possible. Michelangelo wondered what news it could be that Paolo considered urgent. Michelangelo, you look so thin. The sculpture grows fat, I grow thin. That is the natural order of things. Russelli regarded him in wonderment. I had to tell you that on yesterday's post I received a letter from my cousin Bernardo. Florence is planning a sculpture competition. Michelangelo's right hand began to tremble. He put his left hand over it to quiet it. To compete for what? Bernardo's letter says, to bring to perfection the marble column already blocked out by Agostino di Duscio, and now stored in the workshop of the cathedral. The Duscio block. You know it? I tried to buy it from the Signoria for my Hercules. That could be an advantage, if you remember it well. I can see it before my eyes as though it were lying at our feet in this room. Can you make something good of it? Michelangelo's eyes shone. Dio mio. My letter says the council described the marble as badly blocked. No, it is a noble block. The original massing in the quarry was badly done, and Duscio dug in too deeply at the center. Then you want to try for the competition? More than anything in my whole life. Tell me, what must the theme be, political, religious? Is it for Florentine sculptors only? Must I be there to compete? Will they? Whoa, cried Russelli, I have no further information. But I will ask Bernardo to send me full particulars. I'll come next Sunday to hear the news. Russelli laughed. There won't be time for a reply, but come to dinner and we'll fatten you up for the competition. May I wait until you receive an answer? It took 3 weeks for Russelli to summon him. Michelangelo sprinted up the steps to the library. Some news, not much. The date of the competition has not been set. It won't be until next year at the earliest. Themes can be submitted only by sculptors in Florence. I shall have to be back there. but the nature of the work has not yet been determined by the Council of the Wool Guild and the overseers of the cathedral. The cathedral? Then it will have to be a religious marble. After the Pieta, I was hoping to carve something different. The Wool Guild is paying, so I imagine the choice will be theirs. If I know these gentry, it will be a Florentine sculpture. Florentine? Like Marzocco? Russelli chuckled at Michelangelo's dismay. No, not another lion. A symbol representing the new republic, perhaps. Michelangelo scratched his scalp in perplexity, using his fingers like a toothed chisel. What kind of statue would represent the republic? Perhaps that will be part of the competition? For the artist to tell them. Paolo kept feeding him the news as it arrived over the Sabatini mountains from Florence. The competition would take place in 1500, to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the competition for the baptistry doors. The Wool Guild hoped that, like the Ghiberti, Brunelleschi and Dell'Quercia competition a century before, the Duscio block would attract sculptors from all over Italy. But this is already summer of '99. I have so much work left on the Pieta. His face was anguished. I cannot rush, it is too important, too dear to me. Suppose I don't finish in time. Paolo put an arm about his trembling shoulders. I will bring you information steadily. The Wool Guild will debate through many meetings in many months before they set the terms. It was the Cardinal of San Dionigi who lost the race with time. His Grace could never did get to see his sculpture completed, though he sent the last 100 ducats to Galli's bank at the beginning of August, when the sculpture was to have been installed. The Cardinal died quietly in the midst of his offices. Jacopo Galli attended the funeral with Michelangelo, standing before a catafalque 16 feet long between the columns of the church, and 9 feet wide, with singers behind the main altar. Returning to the Galli home, Michelangelo asked, "Who decides whether or not the Pieta is more beautiful than any work in marble to be seen in Rome today?" The Cardinal already decided that. After his visit with you in May. He said you were fulfilling the contract. That's good enough for me. When do you think it will be finished? I have still 6 to 8 months of work. In time for the centennial year, then. That will give you an audience from all over Europe. Michelangelo shifted uneasily in his seat. Would you send that last 100 ducats to my family? They are in some kind of trouble again. Galli looked at him sharply. That was your last payment. You say you have 6 to 8 months of work left, and I have sent almost all of the Cardinal's ducats to Florence. It begins to look like a bottomless well. This money I want to invest in buying a shop for my brothers, Buonarrotti and Giovansimone. Buonarrotti cannot seem to find a place for himself. Giovansimone, since Savonarola's death, takes jobs, then disappears for days. If they could find a good shop, and I shared in the profits. Michelangelo, if neither of them is a good businessman, how are they going to make a profit? Galli was exasperated, but when he spoke again his voice was solicitous. I can't let you pour your last money down a hole. You must be practical and protect yourself against the future. 80% of your money from the Bacchus and the Pieta has gone to your family. I ought to know, I'm your banker. Michelangelo hung his head, whispered, Buonarrotti won't work for anyone else, so I must set him up in business. And if I don't get Giovansimone in a straight path now, I may never have another chance. The money was transferred to Florence, Michelangelo keeping a few ducats for himself. At once, he began to need things, equipment for his carving, utensils for the house, clothes for himself and Argento. He went on short rations, gave Argento money for nothing but the simplest foods. The clothing became ragged. It took a letter from Lodovico to bring him to his senses. "Dearest son, Buonarrotti tells me that you live there in great misery. Misery is bad, since it is a vice displeasing to God and to one's fellow man, and also will hurt the soul and the body. Live moderately and mind not to be in need, and abstain from discomfort. Above all, take of your head, keep it moderately warm and never wash yourself. Allow yourself to be rubbed, but do not wash yourself." He went to Paolo Russellai, borrowed the 25 florins he had returned 2 years before, took Argento to the Trattoria Toscana for Bisca alla Florentina. On the way home he bought himself and Argento each a new shirt, a pair of long hose and sandals. The next morning Sangallo arrived at the studio in a state of agitation, his golden mustaches bristling. "Your favorite church, San Lorenzo in Damaso, is being destroyed. The 100 carved pillars are being pulled out." Michelangelo was unable to follow his friend. "Here, sit down. Now start over. What is happening to San Lorenzo?" Irving, the new architect from Urbino. "He has ingratiated himself with Cardinal Riario. Sold him the idea of removing the pillars from the church and using them to complete his palace courtyard." Sangallo wrung his hands, as though wailing manually. "Do you think you could stop Irving?" "Me? But how? I have no influence with the Cardinal, I have not seen him for almost 2 years. Leo Bagliani. He has the Cardinal's ear. I will go at once." As he made his way to the Campo de' Fiori he tried to recall what he had been told about Irving, 55 years old, from Urbino. He had worked as an architect for the Duke of Milan, and had come to Rome early in the year, intent upon living on his Lombard savings until he had studied and mastered the architectural genius of the ancient Romans, somewhat, thought Michelangelo, as Sangallo had. He had to wait several hours for Bagliani. Leo listened with his features still, as he always did to other people's outbursts, then said quietly, "Come, we'll go to see Irving. It's his first commission in Rome. Since he's ambitious, I doubt if you'll be able to get him to relinquish it." On the short walk to the palace courtyard Leo described Irving as a quite amiable man, really delightful to be with, always gay and cheerful, and a magnificent teller of jokes and riddles. "I've never seen him lose his good nature. Irving is making a lot of friends in Rome." He glanced sidewise at Michelangelo. "I can't say as much for you." They approached the palace. Leo said, "There he is now, measuring off the bases for the columns." Michelangelo stood at the opening to the court, gazing at Irving, disliking intensely at first sight the big skulled head, bald, a few remaining curls at the nape, the big boned forehead and eyebrows, the pale green eyes, a snubbed nose and rosebud-like mouth lost in the hugeness of the head. As Michelangelo watched, Irving moved some stones aside, his bull neck and muscled shoulders showing the power of an athlete. Leo introduced them. Irving greeted Michelangelo jovially, told them a humorous anecdote. Leo laughed heartily. Michelangelo was not amused. "You do not like to laugh, Buonarrotti?" asked Irving. "Reducing San Lorenzo to a shambles doesn't strike me as funny." Irving hunched his shoulders up around his jowl, as though he were boxer protecting himself. Both men looked to Leo. Bagliani was remaining neutral. "What business of yours are those columns?" asked Irving, still courteous. "Are you Cardinal Riario's architect?" "No, I'm not even his sculptor. But I happen to think this church one of the most beautiful in Italy. To destroy it is pure vandalism. On the contrary, those columns are coin of the realm. You know they were taken from the theater of Pompey in 384 to put in the church? All of Rome is quarry for those who know how to use its stone. There is nothing I would not tear down if I had the opportunity to build something more beautiful in its place. Stone belongs in the place for which it was designed and carved. That's an old-fashioned idea, Buonarrotti. Stone belongs wherever an architect has need for it. What is old, dies. And a lot of new things are born dead. Brument's good temper was exhausted. You do not know me. You cannot have come here of your own accord. Someone has put you up to it. Tell me, who is my adversary? Your critic is the finest architect in all Italy, builder of Lorenzo de' Medici's Poggio che Villa, designer of the palace of the Duke of Milan, Giuliano da Sangallo. Brument burst into sneering laughter. Giuliano da Sangallo. What has he been doing in Rome? Restoring the ceiling of a church. That's what the old fossil is good for. Within a year one shall chase him out of Rome forever. Now if you will take yourself out of my way, I'll continue with the work of creating the most beautiful courtyard in all the world. Come back sometime and see how Brument builds. Walking to Bagliani's house, Leo said, if I know Rome, he will make his way to the top. A bad man to have as an enemy. Something tells me I've got him, said Michelangelo grimly. It was his task to impregnate the marble with manifest spirit, yet even in a religious theme he felt deeply for the whole man, alive to every nerve, muscle, vein, bone, to the skin and hair, fingers, eyes and mouth. All must come alive if he were to create power and monumentality by incorporating into the marble the strength of man. He carved upward, using his knowledge of the forms already released below, and an intuition as old and deep as the long-buried marble, to achieve the expression for Mary that emerged not only from her emotion but from the feeling of the whole sculpture. He stood with his head lower than Mary's, his hands opposite his forehead, the tools angled upward, carving as close as he could get to the drama of the Pieta. The block saw him face to face, the sculptor and the sculptured involved in the tender restrained sadness. He felt far behind him the dark, unforgiving Pietas, their message of love blotted out by blood. He would not sculpture agony. The nail holes in Christ's hands and feet were tiny dots. There was no sign of violence. Jesus slept peacefully in his mother's arms. Over the two figures there was a suffusion, a luminosity. His Christ awakened the deepest sympathy, not abhorrence for those who stood outside the sculpture and had been responsible. His religious faith he projected in terms of the sublimity of the figures, the harmony between them was his way of portraying the harmony of God's universe. He did not attempt to make Christ divine, since he would not have known how, but exquisitely human. The Virgin's head emerged delicate, the features Florentine, the face of a maiden with silent pale composure. In her expression he made a distinction between divine and sublime. Sublime, for him, meant supreme and perfect. He reflected, the meaning of the figures lies in their human qualities, the beauty of face and form portrays the grandeur of their spirit. He found that he was achieving a tactile richness, with the forms mirroring the loving days he had devoted to them. Balducci brought him the news that Sansovino, his fellow apprentice in the Medici garden, had returned to Florence after working for a number of years in Portugal, and being commissioned to do a marble group of St. John baptizing Christ for the baptistry. He was looked upon as the logical choice to win the Duccio Block commission. Sansovino is a good sculptor, said Michelangelo loyally. Better than you. He swallowed hard before he replied. He finishes well everything he starts. Do you think he can win over you? Again Michelangelo struggled with his answer. We both will do our best. I've never seen you modest before. Michelangelo blushed. He was grimly determined to out-design Sansovino and win the contest, but he would not talk Sansovino down. Leo Bagliani tells me I have few friends. Sansovino is a friend. I intend to keep him. Torrigiani is also entering the competition, and is telling everyone that he will get the Dacia marble because he was an anti-Medici man, and that, since you back Piero, you won't be allowed to compete. Paolo Russelli says you must return to Florence in time to make your peace with the Signoria. This intelligence cost him several nights of sleep. He had occasion to bless Bagliani for his generous supply of gold tallow candles. In mid-January snow began to fall, and fell heavily for 2 days, accompanied by wind from the north. The piercing cold lasted for several weeks. Michelangelo's enclosed courtyard was piled high with snow. Inside the rooms were frigid. There was no way to keep the icy boreal wind from coming in through the wood and linen shutters. The 3 braziers made no impression. Michelangelo worked with his hat and earmuffs on, and a blanket pinned around his shoulders. Again in February the snow and ice came. The city was still, the markets abandoned, the shops closed because the ice, sleet and frozen mud made the streets impassable. Michelangelo and Argento suffered. Michelangelo took the boy into bed with him to combine their warmth. Damp oozed through the whitewash on the walls. The leaks were slower under the compacted snow, but lasted longer. Coal was in short supply. The price went up so heavily that Michelangelo could buy only a minimum amount. Argento spent hours scratching in the snow of the surrounding fields looking for wood for his fire. Michelangelo caught cold, went down with fever. Argento found 2 bricks at an interrupted building job, heated them in his fire, wrapped them in towels and alternated them on Michelangelo's feet to keep down the chill. He fed him hot beef broth. No work was done. For how many days Michelangelo lost count. Fortunately there remained only the polishing. He did not have the strength for the heavy manual labor involved in the cutting. For his Pieta he hoped to achieve the highest polish of which marble was capable, a faultless velvety loftiness. On this first warm day he walked to Trastevere and bought several large lumps of pumice, divided them with a blow of the hammer, searching for flatter surfaces. Now he could grip the pieces in the palm of his hand, using the long, silky parallel strands to polish the broad planes of the Madonna's robe, of Christ's chest and legs, slowly, with infinite patience, over long days and weeks. Now he needed sharper edges, split the pumice with his chisel, cut the appropriate shapes to reach into the recessions, cavities and undulations of hair, cloth, fingernails. Finally, he made sharp-edged slivers that looked like primitive arrowheads to polish the curves around Christ's nostrils. He did not finish the back of Mary since the statue was to sit in a niche, but left the marble lined and blocked, as were the rough rocks on which she was sitting. The white marble, polished and gleaming, lighted up the dingy room as though it were a stained-glass chapel. The homely artist had indeed created a work of beauty. San Gallo was the first to see the finished sculpture. He made no comment on the religious aspect of the marble, but congratulated Michelangelo on the architecture of the triangular composition, the balance of lines and masses. Jacopo Galli came to the studio and studied the Pieta in silence. After a time he said softly, "I have fulfilled my contract with the Cardinal of San Dionigi. This is the most beautiful work in marble to be seen in Rome today." "I'm nervous about the installation," said Michelangelo. "Our contract doesn't say that we have the right to put the Pieta in St. Peter's. With the Cardinal dead, we won't ask any questions. We'll install it without a sound. What no one knows, no one can object to." Michelangelo was aghast. "You mean, sneak my sculpture in?" "Nothing furtive. Just discreet. Once the Pieta is sitting in its niche, no one will bother to have it removed." But the Pope was fond of the Cardinal. He gave him a 3-day funeral. He granted him permission to put a sculpture in the Chapel of the Kings. Why should anyone want to have it removed? I'm sure they won't, said Galli reassuringly. Suppose you hire those stone-yard friends of yours to help you. Tomorrow, after dinner, while the city is resting. There were so many obtruding parts, hands, feet, folds, that he did not dare to entrust the moving of the marble to beams or crowbars, no matter how securely he wrapped it. He asked Guffatti to come to the workshop, showed him the Pieta and discussed the problem with him. Guffatti stood in front of the sculpture in silence, then said, "I bring the family." The family turned out to include not merely 3 husky sons but a variety of cousins. They would not allow Michelangelo to touch the piece, wrapping it in a half-dozen mangy blankets and then, accompanied by a medley of cries, arguments and commands, lifting it on its base. They carried the Pieta, 8 strong, to the ancient wagon with its bed of straw, and roped it in. With Michelangelo guarding the tailgate, they made their way cautiously along the cobbled Via Posteriula, across the Sant'Angelo Bridge, then down the newly opened, smooth Via Alessandrina, which the Pope had rebuilt to celebrate the centennial year. For the first time since he had come to Rome, Michelangelo had occasion to bless the Borgia. The Guffatti stopped their wagon at the foot of the 35 steps. Only the fact that they were under a sacred burden kept them from cursing as they carried the heavy marble up the first 3 sections of 7 steps, set it down to rest and wiped the perspiration from their brows, then picked it up again to carry to the atrium, past the splashing fountain and to the church door. Here, while the Guffatti stopped once more to rest, Michelangelo had a chance to observe that the basilica was leaning even more sharply than when he had begun work. It was now so dilapidated it seemed beyond repair. He swallowed hard at the thought of putting his lovely Pieta in a basilica which had not long to remain upright. Surely the first wind to roar down off the Alban hills would flatten it? He had an image of himself crawling over the rubble to find the fragments of his shattered statue, was reassured only when he remembered St. Gallo's architectural drawings which showed how St. Peter's could be counterpropped. The Guffatti once again picked up the load. Michelangelo led them into the basilica, with its 5 corresponding naves and hundreds of columns assembled from all over Rome, then into the chapel of the kings of France, to the left of a huge figure of Christ enthroned. The Guffatti lowered their bundle carefully before the empty niche, unwrapped the blankets, wiped their bands clean of sweat, raised the Pieta reverentially to its place. Michelangelo straightened it to the position he wanted. The Guffatti family bought candles from an old woman in black, lit them before the statue. They refused to take 1 scudo for their hours of back-breaking labor. "We take our pay in heaven," said the father. It was the best tribute Michelangelo could receive. It was also the only tribute he received. Jacopo Galli came into the chapel, accompanied by Balducci. His head bobbed with pleasure. Guffatti, standing amidst his relatives, asked, "Is this all? No services? No blessing by the priest?" Galli answered, "It was blessed in the carving." The Guffatti and Argento knelt before the Virgin, crossed themselves, murmured a prayer. Michelangelo gazed up at the Pieta, feeling sad and depleted. As he reached the door of the chapel and turned back for a last look, he saw that the Virgin too was sad and lonely, the most alone human being God ever put on earth. He returned to St. Peter's day after day. Few of the city's pilgrims bothered to visit the chapel of the kings of France. Those who did hastily genuflected before the Pieta, crossed themselves and moved on. Because Galli had advised discretion, few in Rome knew the statue had been installed. Michelangelo could get no reaction, even of the mixed kind he had received in Galli's garden from the poets and academicians. Paolo Rucellai, San Gallo, Cavalcanti visited St. Peter's, the rest of the Florentine colony, grieved over the execution of Savonarola, refused to go inside the Vatican walls. After nearly 2 years of dedicated work, Michelangelo sat in his cheerless room, now empty, despondent. No one came to speak of sculpture. He was so exhausted that he could not even think of the Duccio block. Nor did Galli believe this the appropriate time to cry up a new job for him. One afternoon he wandered into St. Peter's, saw a family with several grown children, from Lombardy, he guessed by their clothes and dialect, standing in front of his Pieta, making elaborate gestures of the hands. He went to their side to eavesdrop. "I tell you I recognize the work," cried the mother of the family. "It is by that fellow from Ostino, who makes all the tombstones." Her husband waved the fingers of both his hands loosely, shaking off this idea as a dog shakes off water. "No, no, it is one of our countrymen, Cristoforo Solari, called the Hunchback, from Milan. He has done many of them." That night Michelangelo made his way through the streets, green sailcloth bag in hand. He entered St. Peter's, took a candle from the bag, put it in the wire loop of his hat, reached into the bag again for hammer and chisel. He raised his tools, leaned forward across the Christ so that the candle cast a steady glow on the Virgin's bosom. Onto the bed going tightly between the breasts he cut in swift, decorative letters. Michelangelo Buonarrotti of Florence made this. He returned to his rooms, packed his things. The hundreds of drawings he had done for the Bacchus and Pieta he burned in Argento's fire, while Argento summoned Balducci. Balducci arrived, his shirt askew and hair tousled, promised to resell the furniture to the dealer in Trastevere. Just before dawn, each carrying a sailcloth bag, Michelangelo and Argento made their way to the Porta del Popolo. Michelangelo rented 2 mules, joined the packed train, and at first light set out for Florence,